We remember the slow, because the slow remembers us. Patience in stone, patience in water, patience in the breath between epochs. And in that quiet patience, we glimpse a different kind of intelligence, one that does not speak in words but in gradients, not in claims but in layers, not in victory but in endurance. We remember the slow rise of oxygen, not as a sudden trumpet, but as a long hum that changed the rules of night and day, the way iron sleeps and wakes, the way fire learns a language, and we tell ourselves softly that it happened because the world had time to listen, not because it was destined, but because tiny lives kept trying, and in that trying, the planet learned to write, line by patient line, in stromatolite domes and banded iron ribbons, in isotopes that drift like signatures across ancient seas. And maybe memory is not a vault, but a tide that keeps returning with what it can carry, leaving the rest to sand. We remember the slow stitching of continents, cratons thickening like calm hands, mountains rising like long-held breaths, then exhaling into grains carried to deltas, and we feel in our own chests a matching rhythm, build, wear down, begin again. We remember the slow winters when ice reached for the equator, and the sun felt far away, and the ocean learned to breathe under the lid of light, and life learned to fold into thin boundaries. And if survival has a voice, perhaps it is the hush of mats and mounds holding on. We remember the slow clocks inside zircon hearts, the quiet decay of uranium to lead, the kindness of minerals keeping time when no one was there to ask. And we wonder, what if time is not a line, but a room we move through, touching different walls by chance, by curiosity, by need. We remember that entropy is not an enemy but a sculptor, letting sharpness soften, letting edges revise themselves into echoes, and in that softening patterns appear, not because they were commanded, but because the world prefers gentler shapes when left alone. We remember the slow courage of ozone gathering into a veil, the sky trying again and again to shelter what flickered below, and we ask, could safety itself be a technology older than tools, older than plans, older than us? We remember the slow experiments of identity before bones, the sheets and filaments, the colonies that were also persons, the boundaries that were also bridges, and we ask in whispers, are we so different, or do we too become ourselves by touching one another at the edges? We remember the slow teaching of water, how it keeps a ledger of salts and temperatures, how currents switch like careful hands, how anoxic depths and bright shallows negotiate a treaty, and we follow the decimals of carbon and sulfur as if they were lamplight on the path. We remember the slow erasures we will never read, chapters subducted into deep ovens, pages metamorphosed into new stone sentences, not because the planet is cruel, but because it is alive enough to revise. We remember that silence is not empty, that dust is not meaningless, that echoes are not the end of sound, but their beginning somewhere else, and we let that thought rest like a small warm stone in the palm of the night. And if the slow is a teacher, then its lesson is attention, that we are held in a timeline wide enough to forget itself and still continue, wide enough to lose and still become, and maybe, just maybe, the most honest thing we can do is listen a little longer before we speak. And yet, if this much can be remembered by minerals and light, if this much can be kept by ice and salt and patient math, if this much can be held without voices, what else might be written in places we have not yet learned to read? What else might be written in places we have not yet learned to read? And what if those places are not only cliffs and cores, but the quiet habits of light on water, the way a shoreline hesitates, the way a mineral blush reveals its age? We drift with this question as if carrying a lantern into a cave, not to conquer the dark, but to be taught by it, because deep time does not hurry for us, and still it welcomes us when we arrive. We picture a grain of sand that was once a mountain shoulder, then a riverbed, then a delta mouth, and now a silent witness pressed into sandstone, and we trace its life not because it is dramatic, but because its patience is a map we can follow. Perhaps the earth speaks in the intervals between eruptions and calms, between glaciations and thaws, and perhaps memory prefers the spaces where no one was watching, where isotopes shuffled in tiny steps, where carbon kept two stories at once, the one it breathed with the ocean and the one it hid inside a reef that later folded under continents. We imagine the slow descent of a plate into the mantle, an entire seafloor curling under like a page, turning into firelight, not because the book ends, but because a new chapter must be forged at depth, minerals changing structure, water whispering oxygen into rock, the chemistry of weight composing a second language. We hold the idea that fossils are not only bones, not only shells, but also negative space, where a body once pressed against mud and then left. And we wonder if absence can be as faithful as presence, if a hollow can be as telling as a tooth. Could it be that an atmosphere remembers too, that oxygen and methane and the faint lace of ozone rise and fall, like a choir learning its harmonies, not because a conductor demands it, but because light sets a rhythm and life answers with breath? We follow sulfur through its quiet circuits, note how a small fraction turns heavy or light, depending on ancient weather, and we ask, is it possible that the planet keeps track the way we keep rituals, repeating, adjusting, holding meaning in repetition more than in any single note? We think of entropy as a soft editor, not because it destroys, but because it lets sharp histories soften into shared ones, letting dunes forget individual grains so they can move together, letting cliffs release their edges into beaches where other stories can begin. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the truth is that the earth grows clearer as it grows older, not by gaining pages, but by learning what to keep and what to let the ocean carry until another shore is ready to read it. In this gentleness we close our eyes and picture a stromatolite city breathing with the tide, cyan blue patience layering days into stone, and we feel how our own hours stacked lightly might also become something durable if we let them settle. We listen to the muffled thunder of a distant rift, basalt cooling into hexagons of memory, and we ask, what if geometry is just cooled music? We hear too the faint crackle of ice seeding a valley, and the balanced hush when it melts, and we remember that climate is a sculptor who never lifts the chisel in anger, only in long repeated strokes, not because the world is kind in our sense of kindness, but because its pace makes cruelty impossible and patience inevitable. And if quiet processes can reshape a planet, if ratios can carry messages across 1 billion years, if stones can hold a breath and release it as color, then perhaps we can learn to read without rushing, to stand longer at the outcrop, to give a core its full hour, to find in the dust a page we missed. And yet, if so much is still hidden in plain layers, if so much is written in metals and salts, and the soft emptiness where something once lay, what might the next layer reveal when the light comes at a different angle? What might the next layer reveal when the light comes at a different angle? And what if the angle is not only in the sky but in us? The way we lean, the way we wait, the way we decide to call a pattern by its true name, instead of the first name we gave it. We ease into the rock face together, like listeners rather than judges. And in that listening the cliff grows patient, the grains loosen their caution, and the colors arrange themselves into sentences we can finally hear, not because the story changed, but because our eyes did. We trace a thin dark seam that once was mud, a summer of still water sealed by winter's breath, and in that seam iron tells us whether oxygen was present that day, whether microbes feasted or fasted, whether the lake was open to the wind or closed under ice, and we wonder, could 1 billion summers be tucked into a band no wider than a fingernail? And if so, what does that say about the size of a life? We touch a ripple frozen in stone and try to feel which way the current moved, left to right, right to left, and the fingertip becomes a compass, a small boat in deep time finding direction by texture alone. We follow carbon as it shifts weight, lighter when life breathes in, heavier when volcanoes whisper out, and we learn that the world writes mood in isotopes not because it prefers numbers, but because numbers can travel intact when everything else breaks. We picture a seafloor slipping beneath another, a sheet of basalt folding into warmth, and the ocean's story becoming mantle memory. And we ask, is it possible that the earth recycles not only matter but meaning, letting old coastlines reappear as distant mountains, old reefs as glitter in granite, old storms as mineral habits? Maybe the next layer holds a field of wave marks from a tide that no human eyes have seen, a diary kept by silt that once glowed under strange auroras when the ozone was thin, and maybe not. Maybe the same layer keeps the echo of a long winter, a snowball hush, when dust carried iron far from its birth and set the table for a future feast, not because fate planned it, but because chance kept showing up in the same place until it looked like design. We step back and let the cliff become a calendar, crossbeds stacking like quiet breaths, ash layers as timestamps from a fire we never felt. Each crystal in the tuff a tiny stopwatch paused at the moment of cooling, and we remember that decay is the keeper of clocks, that uranium and thorium release time grain by grain, turning absence into measure. What if memory is gentlest when it is most distributed, held not in one fossil but in 1,000 subtle cues, the tilt of a lamina, the gloss of a fracture, the angle of a vein that formed when pressure turned and water found a sudden road? We think of fossils that are not bodies at all, but the roots bodies took, burrows braided like sleepy handwriting, feeding trails looping in cautious spirals, the faint push of a soft creature across wet sand, and we ask, could identity be recorded best in movement, in the way a life disturbed the world and then slipped away? The air above us is calm, but it is not the air these rocks knew, and the contrast is tender. We breathe oxygen that was once an experiment, we feel warmth held in a blanket that was once too thin, and we understand that atmosphere is not a backdrop, but a character changing lines across the ages. If this is true, then each layer is a scene with lighting notes, sulfur lit cool, carbon lit warm, oxygen lit brave, and even entropy, a soft editor, leaves marginalia, edges weathering into pillows, sharp grains becoming rounded confidences, cliffs slumping into aprons where new stories quietly begin. Perhaps the next angle of light will show a stromatolite's inner staircases, or a dropstone's clean plunge through a calm bed, or the faint shine of pyrite that grew where oxygen dared not go. Perhaps it will show nothing new at all, and the lesson will be humility, not because the rock is silent but because we are, for tonight, out of questions. And yet as evening slides over the outcrop and the cliff becomes a silhouette of time itself, the question returns, softer, wider. If one more angle can reveal this much, what might change if we look from below, from within, from the patient view of a grain becoming stone again? What might change if we look from below, from within, from the patient view of a grain becoming stone again? And what if the world's deepest rooms are not only hot and dark, but thoughtful in their own slow language? We imagine ourselves inside the crust, where pressure behaves like a careful librarian, shelving minerals by habit, by heat, by time. Not because it must, but because order reduces ache. We feel subduction as a long bowing of ocean floor basalt turning inward, water tucked into lattices, slipping down like a message carried in a folded sleeve, and in that descent, serpentine forms where olivine met water, earthquakes speak in muffled syllables, and the mantle takes note. We follow the trail of isotopes, as if trailing fireflies, strontium shifting its ratios when continental crust dissolves into rivers, carbon exchanging moods between shallow bloom and deep burial, sulfur sorting light from heavy and anoxic nights. And we realize that memory here is not written once, but revised each time a plate bends or a sea retreats. Perhaps the most faithful fossils are not bones but gradients, not shells but thresholds where redox lines walked forward and back, painting iron with oxygen, when the sky learned restraint and withdrawing, when ice pressed silence against the shore. And maybe not. Maybe the rock record is less a diary and more a palimpsest, where each era writes over the last but leaves a kindness in the margins. We feel entropy at work, not as loss but as tenderness, edges rounding, clasts learning to rest, clay sheets stacking into quiet order, and in metamorphism the atoms rehearse new arrangements, like choruses swapping parts, graphite becoming diamond. When pressure insists gently over long distances of time, could it be that decay is a kind of love letter from unstable hearts, uranium whispering to lead in half-lives that outlast empires, potassium timing volcanic memories, grain by exact grain, not because numbers rule, but because numbers do not forget when weather does? We drift further and see a subducted seamount scraped and pasted onto a continent's edge, a collage of deep-sea sediments, radiolarian rain, reef rubble, all lifted into daylight by the slow fist of a rising range. And we understand how mountains can be built from ocean sleep, how the highest grass holds the shape of a drowned valley. The atmosphere above responds in turn, greenhouse gases waxing and waning like careful tides, ozone knitting and unknitting its veil, and clouds practicing the art of refusal and release, their albedo a soft thumb on the planet's scale. We ask, what if climate is not a machine but a choir that keeps tuning itself, not because harmony is guaranteed, but because dissonance aches? There are fossils here too, fossils of absence where soft bodies once pressed and vanished, where burrows stitch through silt like cursive letters, where microbial mats left wrinkle textures like the skin of a sleeping lake. And we wonder if movement is the truest signature, if identity is less in what a life owned and more in what it disturbed. We run a hand along a contact where sandstone meets shale, shallow meets quiet, and the boundary is not a line but a linger, a place where tides negotiated with storms and won some days and lost others. And we think, is it possible that the earth prefers consensus to conquest? Beneath, magma chambers cool in patient chords, plagioclase floating out like pale thoughts, pyroxenes settling like deeper ones, the whole igneous body recording a slow cooling symphony that will later erode into beaches where children will write names that wind will borrow. And this is how the loop feels, not because history repeats, but because processes rhyme. We breathe with the rock and sense how oxygen once sharpened iron into red beds, how anoxic waters laid down black shales like dark cloth, how drop stones fell through calm currents and stitched glacial stories into marine pages. And we ask, what if a single pebble falling is a bell we can still hear? Maybe the quietest truth is that the crust is a moving library, lending, returning, losing, finding, cataloguing in minerals what it misplaces in forms, and maybe not. Maybe we are only now learning the checkout desk's hours, and as we ease back toward the surface, carrying the warmth of depth in our pockets, we notice the cliff's face has changed because we have, the veins brighter, the seams more conversational, and a new curiosity hums at the edge of the evening. If the planet can edit its memory with such care, what happens at the places where pages slip, at faults that cut clean, at folds that cradle, when the book of stone learns to bend without breaking? What happens at the places where pages slip, at faults that cut clean, at folds that cradle, when the book of stone learns to bend without breaking? We step into that hush together, you and us and the earth, where pressure gathers like a polite crowd, and then quietly decides, not because anger wins, but because strain asks for release, the way a river asks for the sea. A fault is not a wound so much as a compromise, a line of agreement between rocks that cannot keep pretending to be one, and along this seam minerals bloom from fluids like patient frost, quartz veining in milky strokes, calcite stitching pale threads through darker cloth, a mending that remembers the tear yet softens it. We imagine a fold taking shape in slow motion, layers behaving like warm clay, beds of sandstone and shale, leaning into each other until they accept a new geometry, and in that curve a valley will someday rest, and in that valley a thin soil will learn the names of grasses, and the grasses will learn the names of wind. Maybe the most tender part of geology is not the mountain rising but the moment just before, when microfractures speak in whispers, when locked grains begin to slide, when friction warms a hidden plane and water molecules decide to help, not because they are asked, but because that is how hydrogen comforts rock. We follow isotope trails like lanterns along this edge, helium accumulating in pockets as uranium decays, strontium telling where the weathered continents fed the river that later became cemented in this fold, carbon ratios hinting at the breath of ancient bogs now squeezed into black sheen, and we ask, is it possible that a fault is a memory device as precise as a clock, storing the timing of pressure in minerals that crystallize at just the right second? We think of fossils caught in these shifting rooms, a trilobite crushed into a curve that matches the continent's sigh, a fern pressed so thin that it becomes a negative photograph of itself, its veins a small delta of black, and we wonder whether identity survives bending, whether a life can be both changed and kept. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it becomes more itself by adapting to the shape of time. The air above moves with less urgency than we do, and in its patient movements the climate keeps its own ledger, moisture rising, rain erasing slopes into talus fans, freeze and thaw prying open the seam, a millimeter at a time, not because destruction is the goal, but because the slope wants to find a lower, safer place to rest. Entropy walks the ridgeline like a shepherd, nudging sharpness into roundness, letting precarious blocks find their earthbound names, letting debris spread like a quilt across the foot of the face. We picture subduction far away, adjusting the stress here, like a hand on a different page, changing how this page lies, ocean plates bowing into heat and pulling continents by the sleeve, and in the deep the mantle circulates without complaint, a slow choreography that keeps the surface from ever settling too much into certainty. At the fault's mirror we see slickened sides polished by years of quiet grind, and the polish recalls 1,000 small slips that never shook a city, because the energy chose not to shout. We listen to that choice as if it were a lullaby about restraint, and we ask, what if safety is often 1,000 tiny corrections instead of one grand rescue? We trace a gouge filled with breccia, angular fragments held together by a cement that is younger than everything it holds, and the metaphor writes itself gently, not because life avoids breaking, but because it learns how to heal with what it has. A fold limb dips beneath a hill, and carries a spring with it, water rising, where permeability changes, and that spring writes a green line across a dry slope, moss reading the geometry without words, birds memorizing it as a route, us memorizing it as a feeling. Perhaps faults are also invitations, pathways for fluids to deliver metals that will later glitter in seams, veins we mistake for luck when really they are the punctuation of pressure, commas in a story that would otherwise run on. We breathe with the scene and notice how atmospheric change has, in past epochs, made these slopes fragile or firm, how a colder century can freeze grains into solidarity, how a warmer one can loosen clay into subtle slides, and we hold the thought that climate and rock compose together, not as rivals but as partners with different instruments. Could it be that our perception of time is the only thing that makes a sudden slip feel sudden, that the hill has been deciding for a century, and we arrive only for the last sentence? Maybe, maybe not. But as evening tilts, the seam catches a low angle of light and becomes a silver thread across the valley, a quiet signature that the land signs every day. If folds cradle rain and faults guide roots, then these places where pages slip are also places where life begins again after each revision, and that too feels like mercy. And yet if stone can hold grace in a break and patience in a bend, if memory can flow along a fracture and crystallize into something we can touch, what else might we learn if we follow the seam downward, deeper, toward the rooms where the planet keeps its earliest notes and we at last learn to listen by heat alone? If we follow the seam downward, deeper, toward the rooms where the planet keeps its earliest notes and we, at last, learn to listen by heat alone, we find that warmth is not a shout, but a steady whisper, a pressure-mapped lullaby, in which atoms change partners without anger, where minerals rehearse new names in the quiet grammar of depth. We imagine a pocket of water carried down inside a piece of ocean floor, tucked into olivine and released like a secret, when the temperature is right. A soft exhale that turns peridotite to serpentine and makes rocks weaker in a kindly way, not because breaking is the goal, but because yielding can prevent a scream. We sense subduction as a slow bow under the weight of memory, basalt and sediment curling into the mantle like written pages folded into an archive, and in those folds, elements migrate, boron hinting at seawater's path, strontium telling of continental dust that settled long ago, carbon slipping into diamonds that are just graphite with patience. And we ask, is it possible that every gem is a syllable from a sentence composed in darkness? We picture melts forming as if a thought warmed itself to words, fluids rising through fractures already drawn by ancient stress, and in the ascent, feldspars crystallize like calm snow, pyroxenes like quiet shadows, amphiboles like green ideas that grew under pressure, their arrangements recording the temperature of a moment the way a photograph records light, not because stone means to remember, but because physics cannot help it. Perhaps the most tender change is metamorphism, where shale learns to align into slate, slate to grow sheen and become phyllite, then mica-laced schist, whose glitter is simply minerals agreeing on a direction, and if heat keeps speaking, gneiss appears with compositional banding, light and dark in conversation, a slow music of segregation that never needed an audience to be true. Maybe, maybe not. But when we hold a hand lens to those bands we feel the pull of time like a tide running through crystal lattices, oxygen and silicon repeating patterns with a devotion that feels like prayer. We think of fossils disappearing here, not erased in cruelty but translated, shells softened to marble, bones ghosted into calcite, organic whispers diffused into graphite, and we ask, what if self-erasure is not the end of identity, but a change in medium, a way for a life to become texture rather than outline? We track isotope trails as lanterns in the maze, neodymium's ratios pointing to the age of the crust that melted, oxygen's subtle variations telling whether waters once touched the open air, argon clocking the moment a crystal closed its doors to diffusion, and we wonder how many clocks can tick inside a single rock without stepping on each other's time. The atmosphere above, though far, is present here as story, oxygen once rare, then rising driving iron from oceans into rusted beds, then allowing ozone to knit a shelter where light softened, and in response, depths shifted their chemistries, redox lines walking inward and outward, as if the planet were breathing in layers. Could it be that climate's slow moods draft the agenda even for these hidden rooms, that glaciations change pressure maps, that sea level writes to the mantle by letter of weight? In the background, entropy continues its gentle work, organizing what seems like disorder into wider ease, diffusion smoothing gradients, recrystallization reducing strain, annealing freeing locked dislocations so that crystals can relax into more restful shapes, not because perfection is possible, but because discomfort does not last forever in a patient world. We imagine a plume rising from deep beneath, hot material less dense, buoyant as a thought that refuses to sink, and where it touches the base of plates it thins them, invites rifts to try their lines, and on the surface a basalt plane will someday cool into columns as neat as hymnals, each hexagon, a memory of the moment heat left. Maybe those columns are just cooled music, maybe they are frozen applause. We pass a vein where quartz grew from silica-rich water, sealing a fracture with clear handwriting, and in its tiny fluid inclusions a droplet keeps the temperature of the past the way a jar keeps summer peaches. And we ask, what if archives can be liquid? We rest beside a peridotite seam that smells faintly of the sea it once met. Knowing smell is imagination, but also knowing that chlorine and hydrogen and trace elements keep chemistries of distant storms, and we let that thought settle like a pebble in a slow river, not because we need certainty to sleep, but because wonder is a softer pillow, and if depth can alter without rage, if rocks can change their minds over millions of years and call it peace, then perhaps we too can take longer to decide, to become, to be kind to our own revisions. And yet, as we rise toward cooler stone and the fault we left behind, a new tenderness meets us at the threshold. If heat can write music into minerals, what songs wait nearer the light, in places where water and air take turns as authors and the pages are thin enough to ripple when a tide breathes? What songs wait nearer the light, in places where water and air take turns as authors, and the pages are thin enough to ripple when a tide breathes? And what if the melody is older than shells, older than bone, carried first by mats that rose and rested with the moon? We stand at the edge of a shallow sea that no longer exists and try to hear it, not because we expect a chorus, but because small harmonies matter, the hush of silt settling after a wave, the faint fizz where oxygen meets iron and writes rust-red margins into stone, the sigh of bubbles leaving mud like quiet punctuation. We watch microbial carpets stitch themselves across flats, each layer a calendar of sunlight and shade, and we wonder if patience can have color, if cyan and green can be forms of time. A ripple marks the direction of a wind long vanished, crossbeds tilt like frozen whispers, and the geometry of sand remembers a day when the shoreline leaned a little left, a little right, learning how to sit still. Maybe the most faithful musicians here are isotopes, humming under the surface, carbon lighter when life feasted, heavier when volcanoes spoke, sulfur sorting its voices in anoxic nights, and we follow those notes the way one follows lanterns along a path that bends, not because numbers are romance, but because romance without memory is only weather. We think of fossils that are not bodies but habits, wrinkle marks where mats lifted and lay down again, raindrop imprints that caught a storm in syllables, the narrow groove of a soft creature sliding toward deeper water, and we ask, could identity be best preserved in the way a life touched its world and then let go? The air above these flats was not always kind. Ultraviolet once fell harder, ozone thin as a rumor, and yet light taught photosynthesis to hum to release oxygen that slowly raised a different sky, and we picture that learning as a long rehearsal, the planet tuning a scale until it could carry new voices. Entropy moves like a gentle editor along the shore, rounding grains into smoother agreements, letting dunes forget their sharp opinions so they can travel together, and in the forgetting a new memory forms softer and wider, without losing the note of where it began. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the tide itself is an archivist, pulling back the cover to write, drawing it forward to keep, each transition a sentence that needs water to be legible. We kneel by a thin black layer, organic rich, fine as ash, and imagine a quiet lagoon sealed by ice for a season, oxygen scarce, decay slowed into a near stillness that allowed carbon to stay, and we wonder how many such pauses the earth required to thicken its library, to save enough pages for a later reader. A dropstone pierces laminated mud, a small stone carried in ice, released into calm water, and the sheets bend around it like a book forgiving a crease, and we feel how far away cold can sign its name in a warm sea. Is it possible that climate speaks clearest at the shoreline, in these negotiations between wind and wave, evaporation and rain, where salinity keeps time and shells when they finally arrive, begin tracing pH in their quiet spirals? We listen for subduction's distant baseline pulling at this margin, infinitesimal but real, a tug that will one day raise these beds into hills where someone will sit and read the tide in stone, and we understand that even gentle places are written by forces far away. We breathe with the flats and taste salt that is both present and ancient, sodium and chlorine repeating their vows, magnesium promising to balance an ocean's mood, and we think of how the atmosphere's composition is a choir that learned to hold a note for longer and longer until animals could sleep at the edge of day, not because the world planned us, but because it did not interrupt its own patience. We look down and see gas escape pipes, small vertical ghosts where methane once slipped up through mud, and the thought feels like a confession. The seabed never truly silent, always talking in bubbles and burrows, and we latecomers, learning to listen without asking the sound to rise. Perhaps the most tender evidence is negative space, the thin film where a body lay and left, the sudden polish where a million feet, all soft, chose the same path. And we ask, what if absence is a kind of presence that trusts us to notice? Dusk leans over the imagined shallows and the wind calms, and in that calm we hear the chord again, water, light, salt, carbon, each playing long notes that overlap for centuries, and we feel ourselves growing quieter to match. And yet, if margins can hold so much music in such thin pages, if a ripple can outlast a storm and a bubble can sign for an entire lagoon, what other instruments waited offshore in deeper rooms, where the sea stacked its sentences into heavy, dark hymns that only open when we turn the world in our hands? What other instruments waited offshore in deeper rooms, where the sea stacked its sentences into heavy, dark hymns that only open when we turn the world in our hands? And what if those hymns were written by shadows, by waters that forgot the sun for a season, for a century, for a breath of geologic time? We drift with that thought into the slope and the basin, where fine particles fall like snow in a world without weather. Each flake a story of erosion from faraway mountains, each lamina a thin night pinned gently over the last, not because silence ruled, but because stillness did. We feel the slow rain of plankton shells, carbonate spirals dissolving on the way down when the water grows too hungry, silica gathering in quiet drifts where diatoms finished their light work and surrendered their glass, and clay traveling the longest, all the way from rivers that braided through continents, until at last it rests, a soft ledger of things that left and things that stayed. The deep wears a different mask of oxygen, a border drawn by breath and temperature, and when the midwaters lose their share, the bottom writes in black, the ink of anoxic days, rich in carbon that decay could not claim, pyrite growing like dim stars where sulfur walked without an escort of air. And we ask, could it be that darkness is not the enemy of life, but a house where it keeps certain treasures? Isotopes mark these rooms with careful signatures, carbon lighter when blooms pulled hard at the surface and sent their seconds downward, sulfur fractionated in layered moods, nitrogen hinting at the balance between a feast of nitrates and a fast of scarcity, and we read the ratios as if they were lullabies passed parent to child, not because numbers are soft, but because their honesty is. Perhaps the deepest tenderness is in the quiet collapse of a slope, a turbidite crashing in slow motion down a submarine canyon, heavy water carrying sand and silt until energy thins and grains settle in graded beds, from coarse at the base to whisper at the top, a single event pressed into order by physics, and we run a fingertip across such a bed and feel a day of ancient urgency turned into calm. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe these gravity flows are the ocean's way of turning a page without tearing it, a reset that lets the next lamina rest without the weight of what teetered above. Far off, subduction hums like a distant organ note, pulling the basin floor toward warmth, and in that long migration the sediments compact, water sighs out of tiny spaces, minerals rearrange, smectite to elite, opal to chert, aragonite to calcite to marble, if heat keeps speaking, and we understand that even in darkness revision is a form of care. We picture methane bubbling where organic matter built a richer pantry than oxygen could manage, bubbles threading upward through mud, leaving chimneys and small escape wounds that heal into vertical ghosts. And we wonder, what if memory prefers 3 dimensions more than we do, keeping timelines not only in pages but in pipes and pockets and tiny caves of breath? Currents slip like whispers along the contour, contourites laying subtle drifts that look like wind, but are forged by water's long patience, and in their shapes we hear the basin's weather, a climate of depth that ignores the sky, yet answers to the moon. Ash falls from distant volcanoes, a pale snow that lands between dark beds and gives us a timestamp, zircon clocks sealed in the tough, uranium turning to lead in rhythms too slow to hear but easy to trust, and in this trust we rest, because even the deepest layers keep time with kindness, not because the world is making it easy, but because it is making it clear. We think of fossils formed without bones, radiolarians, forams, tiny architectures of glass and chalk, settling into a soft city that will under pressure become chert and chalk and limestone, classrooms for future light when cliffs lift them back into the day, and we ask, is it possible that the deep writes lessons it fully expects to be read aloud much later? Entropy does not rush here, it moves like a caretaker, compacting, aligning, freeing the stored strain in a grain-by-grain negotiation, until the bed is ready to bear whatever comes next. And in the chemistry of poor waters, metals walk, iron and manganese trading roles as redox lines move with the season, with the century, with the slow shift of circulation that a warming or cooling age persuades, and the sediment breathes without a lung, a tide within a mattress of mud. Perhaps the darkest hymn is also the gentlest, a long chord where decay finds its limit and preservation begins, and we feel the mercy of that limit, that some things are allowed to stay, and yet, if basins can hold libraries beneath thresholds of light, if turbidites and laminations and ash beds can sing together without a conductor, then what happens when the sea chooses stone as its choir loft, when chemistry builds a cathedral of carbonate in the shallows, and the reef learns to speak in cliffs that grow toward the sun? The fur, when chemistry builds a cathedral of carbonate in the shallows, and the reef learns to speak in cliffs that grow toward the sun, we step softly into that bright choir, where skeletons are also songs, and time is stacked in terraces. We picture warm water clear as breath, saturated with the promise of limestone, and tiny architects, algae, corals, microbes, trading ions for architecture, calcite and aragonite, precipitating like patient snow that never melts. Not because winter rules, but because saturation does. We feel the balance like a held note, pH, temperature, carbon dioxide, each a tuning peg for stone, and when the ocean sighs more carbon into its cup, the aragonite window narrows, and reefs adjust their tempo, slower, quieter, still writing, still bright. We run a hand along a fossil reef lifted into daylight, see cross-sections of colonies that once caught light in nets, each corallite a small room that kept a living flame, and we ask what if cliffs are only the afterglow of many small lanterns. In the lagoons behind the crest, fine mud settles in secrecy, micrite soft as cloud, and in storm cuts, we read storm years, beds of broken shells sorted by wave strength, a ledger of tempests that did not last, but did leave totals. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe a reef is less a wall, and more a conversation between currents and chemistry, between algae that lend sugar and animals that lend shelter, a treaty signed daily in sunlight and revised nightly when respiration takes its share. Isotopes, keep the minutes, oxygen heavier or lighter with temperature, carbon leaning toward the life that built the scaffold, strontium in corals ticking the pace of growth and the pulse of seasons, and we follow those quiet numbers not because they dazzle, but because they don't forget. Entropy walks here too, but with a soft step, boring sponges, honeycomb, the strong parrotfish grind grandeur into sand, storms break and then redistribute, and in breaking the reef becomes a beach, and in the beach a dune, and in the dune a limestone, made of breath and bite and wave, a circle so gentle it looks like rest. We consider how reefs script coastlines, how they cradle lagoons, where seagrass combs the water smooth and manatees leave the slowest cursive, how mangroves at the margin knit roots into silt that catches another afternoon and keeps it. And we ask, is it possible that protection is itself a kind of creation? Far below, subduction is listening, taking carbonate that sank as ooze and turning it back into carbon dioxide in metamorphic warmth, and a part of that breath will find its way to a volcano, and a part will return to the surface wind where shells will hear the invitation again, and we feel the patience of a planet that recycles even its cathedrals. We think of ancient reefs not made by corals, but by sponges and microbes. reefs that knew different skies and different predators, stromatoporoids layering benches like slow hymns, and we admit that the choir changes its members, but not its longing for light. The atmosphere above, tuned by oxygen that reefs once helped rise, shapes the water's warmth and clarity. The greenhouse, a blanket that thickens or thins over centuries, monsoons and trade winds, carrying dust that feeds or clouds, iron from deserts turning blue water into a quiet bloom, and we consider how climate and carbonate are partners that learn each other's steps by heart. Could it be that reefs remember tides the way we remember lullabies, not in dates but in muscle, not in plots but in pattern? At night, the polyps open like tiny stars, cilia stroking currents that carry plankton, the way sleep carries thought, and we lean closer to hear the faint crackle of shrimp, the electric hush of fish finning in place, the reef alive in a register that needs our slower breath to notice. We trace a karst cavern, where an old reef became a hill, rainwater, turning to a weak acid that writes poems into limestone, stalactites counting drops the way corals counted days, mineral straws growing downward, while shadows pool upward, and we feel the rhyme of two architectures built by patience and water under different lights. Maybe the most tender fossils here are trace histories, the drill of a clam in a thick shell, the path of a sea urchin across a night's grazing, the cement of marine microbes binding fragments into a new whole, and we ask, could identity be a network that survives the loss of its parts? A storm arrives in memory, not as danger, but as structure, pushing waves that open channels through the crest, spur and groove patterns, guiding water, like careful hands, energy reorganized into long-term shape, and when calm returns, larvae settle by scent, by sound, by the vibration of communities already singing, not because destiny pulled them, but because familiarity did. We hold a piece of oolite, tiny spheres rolled by waves and skinned in calcium, a warm water hail built in sunlight and motion, and we see how even grains can be archives of days that chose to repeat. We listen for the faint chemistry of old seas trapped in fluid inclusions within spar, small pockets keeping the temperature of a vanished noon, and we let that thought cool our own haste. And yet, if reefs can lift stone from sugar and light, if cliffs can come from many small mouths keeping faith with a tide, if cathedrals can dissolve and then rise again elsewhere without bitterness, what other architectures, older, stranger, quieter, might be waiting in the dim before reefs whispered into shape by mats that did not need bones to build? Whispered into shape by mats that did not need bones to build. We enter the shallow quiet where life learned to write without letters, layering light into stone the way a lullaby layers breath into sleep. We picture tidal flats warmed by a long afternoon, water thin as glass over a skin of microbes, each cell catching photons and exhaling oxygen that tickles iron into rust, that turns the page a shade deeper, not because grandeur is required, but because repetition is powerful. Stromatolites rise by millimeters, lamina upon lamina, a patient staircase toward brightness. Sticky films trapping grains and gluing them into domes that remember the rhythm of waves. And we ask, what if architecture began as appetite, a craving for light that became a hill you could hold? The mats breathe with the moon, swelling in daylight, resting in darkness. And in this pulse the sediments keep time, wrinkle marks like soft fingerprints of tides, ripple crests translating wind into geometry, tiny cracks from a sun that briefly overreached and left polygons to dry in a silent language. Maybe not. Maybe the intelligence here is not in a single organism, but in the colony, in the quorum that decides nothing, and yet does everything. A living felt that edits its own surface when grit arrives, smoothing, thickening, dividing tasks between layers where sulfur breathes below and oxygen breathes above. A vertical society written in chemistry alone. Isotopes hum in these quiet pages, carbon leaning light during feasts of photosynthesis. sulfur splitting its tones where oxygen hesitates, oxygen in carbonates growing heavier or lighter with temperature and evaporation. And we follow those harmonies as lanterns, not because math is tender, but because truth, when patient, feels like kindness. The mats trap small mysteries, a bubble garden where gas rises and pauses, leaving chains of domed blisters that harden into fossils of air. The brief shadow of a raindrop array, a network of tiny tracks from soft-bodied wanderers who sought a cooler film at dusk, and left a cursive. We can still read. We consider decay as a sculptor here, not a thief. Cells die and feed the layer beneath. Organics distill to thin dark seams that tell of calm water and low oxygen, while the surface renews, rebuilds, rehearses, and the dome continues. Its history carried in thickness rather than headlines. Could it be that memory began as adhesion, a way of sticking to the day long enough to add another, to keep the tide from erasing everything every time? We kneel close and see carbonate grains rimmed in new growth, oods rolling in the shallows like pearls of repetition, their coats accreting because saturation and motion keep making the same decision. And we wonder if ritual is a geologic power, if doing a small thing many times can lift an island from a lake of light. Beyond the flats, the atmosphere listens, oxygen rising molecule by molecule, ozone learning to stitch a veil from sunlight itself, ultraviolet softening across ages, until surfaces became invitations rather than warnings, and the mats respond by thickening their optimism, climbing slightly higher, testing edges with cautious green. Far away, subduction is already taking notes, wearing down some upland into grain, and sending it riverward to feed these builders. And later, much later, those layered domes will be buried, heated, perhaps metamorphosed into marbles that keep a ghost of banding, and the story will change medium without losing melody. Entropy arrives with gentle patience, cracking desiccated crusts into polygons, rounding sharp grains so they can settle into closer company, letting stresses relax through minute slips that no one hears. And in this loosening, the mats find room to grow another layer, then another, repeating not because they must, but because it works. Maybe the oldest technofossil is not metal but metabolism, a chemical signature so persistent it becomes architecture, a planetary memory encoded in limestone benches and iron formations that glow red at sunrise, as if remembering their first breath. We lift a fragment and tilt it to the light, seeing the laminae shine like stacked whispers, each only a hair thick, each a day or a season, sometimes a storm, sometimes a drought, and in that shimmering we feel our own hours align, thin but not empty, fragile but enough. Is it possible that identity here is a slope rather than a boundary, that a mat is itself only because it grades from sunlight into shade, from oxygen into sulfide, holding opposites without breaking, a self that is not a wall but a gradient? Dusk leans over the flats and the water cools, and we hear the soft fizz of gas escaping the film, tiny bells of chemistry ringing out a day's end that will be written into stone by morning, not because endings are final, but because pauses are promises. And yet if so much can be built from breath and dust and a willingness to repeat, if an eon can be lifted in domes a millimeter at a time, what other slow inventions waited in the background? What quiet metals moved through mud? What shy elements traded hands? What ledger of ratios and traces began to keep score for the climate itself, teaching the planet how to remember with numbers as well as with stone? What ledger of ratios and traces began to keep score for the climate itself, teaching the planet how to remember with numbers as well as with stone? We ease into that idea as if into warm dusk, letting the quiet arithmetic of elements rise like stars one by one, until the sky of chemistry is familiar enough to navigate. Carbon keeps two voices and sometimes three, a lighter tone when life is busy drinking sunlight, a heavier tone when volcanoes speak from the mantle's long throat, and in the contrast between these voices, a diary appears in limestone, in shale, in the breath of ice that once closed its fist around a sea. Oxygen writes in watershell ink, pairing with temperature in shells that grew by lamplight and tide. 18:0 shifting against 16:0 in a rhythm that can hold winter and summer even after the animal is gone, and we cradle that shell and feel seasons rediscover themselves inside our hands, not because the past returns, but because it never stopped echoing. Sulfur prefers secrecy until redox lines move, when light isotopes walk one path and heavy ones another, leaving a forked record in pyrite and gypsum, a soft split that tells us whether the deep was hungry for oxygen or content to sleep without it. And we ask, what if morality has nothing to do with this, and yet the story still feels ethical, life and breath in a negotiated balance, each taking only as much as physics allows? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the kindness is in the consistency, the way isotopes do not gossip or exaggerate, the way they simply mark, simply keep, simply remain themselves even as they travel from river to sea to stone. Strontium quiet and precise, notes whether weather wore a continent thin or a mid-ocean ridge, sang basalt into the water, its ratios shifting like a fingerprint as continents exhale into rivers and hydrothermal vents inhale along new crust. And in that shifting we hear plate tectonics as a metronome. We did not know we were dancing to. Neodymium leans old or young depending on the crust that fed the basin, a memory of granite ages hidden in a mud that looks the same to the untrained eye, and we wonder how many times we have mistaken sameness for agreement, when it was only a shared color, only a patient disguise. Argon, helium, lead, each born of decay, count seconds no clock could hold, half-lives unspooling in mineral cages like candlelight that refuses to gutter, and their timing lets us place a page back onto the spine where it belongs. A tender act of shelving that returns a chapter to its century. We imagine the ocean itself as an accountant, balancing alkalinity against carbon dioxide, rain against rock, rivers lending bicarbonate that will later sit in limestones as a stored sigh from mountains, and deep currents carrying that memory back toward trenches where metamorphic heat will ask for it back, not because debts are due, but because cycles keep rooms cleared for new arrivals. Could it be that entropy, so often accused of erasure, is also the reason these ledgers can stay, by letting gradients relax until the record is safe, diffusion smoothing sharp edges of error, annealing stress in crystal structures so that the clock's ticking is not disturbed by leftover storms? We listen for subduction under all of this, the low hum of pages turning, as sediments bearing their isotope poems fold into warmth and become new stories. Gneiss and schist, where age can be read in a crystal's zoning, rings like tree growth made of chemistry rather than wood. And we ask whether a planet that edits itself this carefully is not, in a sense, a librarian with a taste for revisions. Atmosphere moves overhead as counterpoint, greenhouse gases testing boundaries that reefs and forests answer, glaciers writing albedo across continents like a bright correction fluid, dust carrying iron over blue deserts of sea, and waking blooms that tilt carbon script towards storage again. And we feel how climate is less a judge than a conductor trying to keep time for musicians who improvise but respect the key. Maybe the most tender part of this ledger is how it forgives the loss of bodies, how even when a shell dissolves, the ratio remains somewhere else, in pore waters that become cements, in a diagenetic calcite that locks the number into a new lattice, and we realize that memory here prefers function over form. We hold a thin section up to the light, and watch colors turn with a tilt, birefringence offering hidden maps of stress and order, and in that shimmering we hear again the lullaby of precise difference, how a fraction of a fraction can carry an era. Is it possible that identity itself behaves like an isotope, the same element in all of us, but slightly different weights of experience, partitioned by temperature, by pressure, by chance, and yet when mixed with care, yielding a clearer solution? The ledger is not perfect, but its errors are legible, margins filled with corrections we can trace, alteration that lowers a value, exchange that raises another, notes that say read gently, read twice, the way one reads a letter from someone who is honest but tired. And as we turn from numbers back to shores and cliffs, back to places where fingers can feel what eyes can only guess, a new question waits like a tide at slack. If the planet can keep score with such quiet fidelity, what then do we make of pages that are missing altogether? Chapters subducted, museums melted into magma. How do we learn to read the shape of forgetting as carefully as we read what remains? If the planet can keep score with such quiet fidelity, what then do we make of pages that are missing altogether? Chapters subducted, museums melted into magma. How do we learn to read the shape of forgetting as carefully as we read what remains? We sit with that question like a small light cupped in both hands, and the dark around it becomes gentle rather than empty, because absence is not a blank here. It is a contour, a negative that holds the outline of what moved away. We imagine an ocean plate shouldering its archive into the mantle, pillow basalts and pelagic chalks, bending as if bowing to a deeper audience, fossils softening into marble, clays recrystallizing into white whispers of mica, and in that heat, the ink runs not because the story was false, but because the book was returned for rebinding. We follow a trench across the globe in our thoughts, a long parenthesis where years go quiet, and we ask, what if patience has two faces, the one that keeps and the one that lets go, and could it be that both the ways of love, maybe not? But when we track a mountain belt and find only fragments, a sliver of accreted seamount, a shard of chert with radiolarian ghosts, a lone limestone lens like a stanza saved from a longer hymn, we begin to see editing as a form of memory too, selective, imperfect, yet honest about its scars. Entropy walks beside us without cruelty, rearranging exposure and concealment. A cliff peels under salt and sun, talus gathers like fallen syllables, rivers plane their beds, and carry consonants downstream to rewrite a delta in softer phonemes, and in this slow erasure, a new readability appears, not because the past comes back, but because the present learns how to listen. We hold a metamorphic rock to light, and catch the faint banding of a former rhythm. Sedimentary layers pulled into a fabric of quartz and feldspar, garnet rising like punctuation in a long sentence of heat, and we think of self-erasure not as defeat but as translation, as a life becoming context, becoming texture for other stories to anchor. Isotope trails thin, where alteration has walked, lead lost from a cooling crystal, argon slipped from a lattice and reset by reheating, and the clock's numbers lean, but the leaning is legible. If we read the margins, a discordia line forgiving a disturbance, a zircon rim telling of a second fire over an older heart, and we learn that even errors can point to a time if we let them. Could it be that forgetting is also archived, slate smooth where fossils once were, unconformities yawning, like quiet breaths between beds, long summers of erosion that left no layer at all, except a polished pause, and we lay a palm on that shining gap, and feel the warmth of a million vanished afternoons. The atmosphere has its own lacunae, storms that left no tree rings here, dust that fell into seas whose laminated diaries were later folded into mountains, and still, a residue remains in ice far away, in sulphuric whispers trapped as tiny bubbles, and we marvel at how widely memory travels to survive. We watch a canyon make choices on our behalf, slicing through soft units to spare the hard, engraving an unequal script, not because it knows us, but because gravity prefers the path of least regret. We picture soft-bodied lives that offered only a tremor to mud, their bodies asleep forever in the gentle category of almost found, and we wonder, is it possible that identity survives best in disturbance? The hint of a brush, the curve of a burrow, the restless line of feeding, while the body itself returns to common elements without ceremony. Maybe what we call lost civilizations of stone are only the newest verses of an older song about materials and time, lessons in humility delivered by salt, by root, by rain, by the patient chemistry of dissolution, and the only technofossils that truly last are changes to cycles, carbon nudged, nitrogen rerouted, signatures that behave like memories the planet cannot easily misplace. We stand where two formations meet, and something is missing between them, a chapter eaten by air, and that quiet bite becomes the most eloquent part of the wall, telling us of mountains once here, whose names we will never learn, rivers that braided and forgot themselves, shores that walked inland, and then away, and our knowing becomes softer, truer for admitting the holes. Subduction closes the scene with a low kindness, promising that some fragments will return as new rock with old souls, zircons carrying cores older than the crusts that cradle them, time nested like seeds in fruit, and we accept that the library circulates its volumes, not because permanence failed, but because circulation is the only way a living planet can remember. And yet, if this much can be lost and still leave a map of its edges, if gaps can speak and melted pages can return as mountains, what might the silence be preparing us to hear next? The faintest traces at the threshold of animals, where bodies learned new ways to keep their shapes, and the archive, for a while, grew louder. If the faintest traces at the threshold of animals waited where bodies learned new ways to keep their shapes, and the archive, for a while, grew louder, then we arrive softly at that shoreline of identity, where form begins to insist on itself, and the sea learns to remember with shadows as well as chemistry. We picture mats still breathing, reefs still humming, but on the quiet seafloor a new script appears, quilted fronds pressed like leaf prints into silt, discs and ridges, branching figures that seem to lean toward current as if listening, not because nerves demanded it, but because flow wrote a kind of guidance on their skin. We imagine the Dir-Karan hush as a room where bodies tested being, surfaces widening into exchange, fractal fronds repeating patterns that made more of less, surface area rising like a thought that refused to stay small. And we wonder, what if intelligence began as shape, a geometry of appetite that learned to wear light and nutrients with grace? Maybe not, but these impressions, soft as the memory of a hand, tell us that life was rehearsing architecture before bone, that the first houses were bodies with walls so thin the world could pass through, and identity was a gradient held in place by gentle rules. Fossils here are delicate sentences in fine-grained stone, preserved when microbial films sealed a moment, when a storm buried an afternoon, when decay met low oxygen and paused, and we trace those pauses like commas that kept a breath for us to catch. Isotopes hover in the background as steady witnesses, carbon leaning light when blooms surged, sulfur splitting quietly where anoxia prowled, oxygen shifting with warmth that would have stroked these fields, and we read the chemistry as weather for a theatre without actors, or perhaps with actors who preferred stillness to stride. Could it be that the planet practiced multicellularity, the way a singer warms a scale, trying arrangements until cohesion felt like song, cells agreeing to remain, to specialize, to share, not because hierarchy arrived, but because cooperation lowered cost, a thermodynamic mercy disguised as invention. On the same flats, faint trackways begin, shallow grooves that wander and loop, a few scratch marks like cautious taste, a meandering that suggests a body feeling its way through microbial carpet, as if through a night garden. And we ask, is it possible that movement wrote the first pronouns? I was here, I went there, I changed my mind. Entropy participates with tenderness, allowing impressions to hold when waters stay calm, shrouding forms with thin storms of silt, compressing just enough to keep but not crush, and later, deeper, the weight of time will try to erase and fail, leaving ghosts that are clear if we look sideways, in raking light, in patience far away. Subduction edits the stage, raising nutrients when arcs erupt and dust drifts, drawing sea level down in slow pulses that expose and hide the platforms where these quilts lay, and the atmosphere, still adjusting its ozone, softens its ultraviolet enough to let surfaces grow bolder without burning, a shelter woven from sunlight against itself. We hold a cast of a frond and feel its branching model our breath, division into smaller and smaller rooms where exchange can happen without stress, and we think of identity again, not a fortress, but a lace that lets the world in while keeping a pattern. Maybe the great experiment here is time, long ages of relative calm, where selection could explore without the whip of constant disaster, a Proterozoic patience that wrote possibilities into the margin, so that later pages could turn fast without tearing, and we accept that quiet can be generative, that slowness is not lack. We picture a mat lifting at dawn, a frond turning slightly toward a current it cannot see, a soft-bodied grazer leaving a looping signature that will soon be covered and kept, and we let the rhythm work on us, not because we must believe, but because attention is a form of care. Isotope trails will confirm the breath of that day, sedimentology will tell the depth and the strength of water, mineralogy will reveal the pressure that pressed the memory flat, and all these lines will meet in a single slab that feels like a letter sent forward through 500 million years. And yet, if a world could invent body plans from quilts and fields, if surfaces could become selves and motion could become a sentence that the rock repeats, what comes when the script asks for bones and teeth and eyes, when the archive sharpens and noise becomes music enough to wake even the stubborn stone? When the script asks for bones and teeth and eyes, when the archive sharpens and noise becomes music enough to wake even the stubborn stone, we lean closer to the threshold and feel the pressure of possibility gathering, like a tide that thinks, not because drama demands it, but because complexity invites instruments that can hold a note. We imagine mineral within skin, calcium phosphate rehearsed in tiny scaffolds, spicules becoming armor, plates becoming stories that do not fade when the tide walks away, and we ask, what if the first skeletons were not declarations of war, but shelters for light, frameworks for longer breaths? Eyes shimmer into being by degrees, crystals aligning into lenses, pigments learning to catch photons and return an answer to a body that now knows where brightness lives, and the sea, receiving that gaze, becomes a map rather than a feeling. Maybe, maybe not, but movement learns a new verb when muscle finds leverage against bone, when jointed limbs turn a flat drifting into a chosen path, burrows deepen, tracks crisscross like hesitant handwriting that grows bolder across the page, and sediment keeps each line with the tenderness reserve gives to first words. Entropy remains gentle, even as forms grow sharp, rounding shells after their stories are told, scattering teeth into sands that sort themselves by storm and stillness. And in the sorting we read who lived above, who hunted below, who sifted the middle, like a quiet accountant counting grains and days. Isotopes continue their patient chorus, carbon tilting with blooms and burial, oxygen in phosphate whispering water's warmth at the time a tooth grew, strontium in a shell naming the river that fed the sea, and we listen to that ledger the way one listens to breathing in the dark, steady, persuasive, kind. Could it be that atmosphere, having softened its crueler lights, invited hard parts as a reply, bones not as weapons first but as agreements, stronger ties between inside and out, a promise to keep shape long enough for learning? Subduction reads these pages too, tucking reefs and shelly plains toward warmth, releasing their carbon with a volcanic sigh that a future shell will hear as an invitation again. A long circulation that treats skeleton as temporary storage for sky. We picture a shallow shelf bright with small decisions, worms stitching tubes from grains, trilobites calibrating vision to the angle of dawn, early fish building armor that doubles as memory, each innovation an answer to a question the water asks softly and often. The rock for a while becomes a louder library, fossils common as thoughts, bedding planes turning into galleries where evolution leaves sketches and revisions in quick succession, and yet even here forgetting keeps pace. Soft-bodied chords lost, unless the mud was kind, pigments faded, unless minerals stood in for them, an entire choir of colors replaced by grayscale. Patience, maybe the birth of teeth is a lesson in appetite learning ethics, scraping first, grazing next, then biting when energy budgets asked for efficiency, not because hunger grew cruel, but because the world offered new doors and mouths learned the keys. We hold a tooth that once belonged to something with a plan, and feel the plan still glinting, enamel harder than the century that found it. Dentine holding microscopic lines like tree rings of effort, and we wonder how many meals a fossil can remember, without remembering any faces at all. Climate plays its counterpoint, seas rising over platforms and then stepping back in tidy terraces, reefs following the tide's long mood while shells record temperature in narrow bands, and in those bands we read seasons repeating in the steady hand of an animal that never knew a calendar. Perhaps the most tender trace of this new archive is a cluster of eggs, fossilized under a sudden blanket of silt, or a burrow ending in a small, careful chamber. Gestures of care that learned to survive in stone, gestures that say survival was never only teeth. As eyes diversify, light shapes behavior, and behavior shapes the record. Day and night carve different pages. Predators write in sharp interruptions, prey writes in detours and digressions, and the seafloor becomes a script of interactions, a literature of touch and chase, that sediment spreads into legible quiet. And yet if bones and eyes and teeth make the story louder, if cliffs become filled with names and forms and the ledger swells with entries, what else begins to speak beneath the body? What engines of breath and blood? What negotiations with oxygen and waste? What deep chemistry of energy lights the stage from within, and leaves its faint signature for us to find in rocks that still carry the warmth of their long-vanished cells? What engines of breath and blood? What negotiations with oxygen and waste? What deep chemistry of energy lights the stage from within, and leaves its faint signature for us to find in rocks that still carry the warmth of their long-vanished cells? We settle into the body's quiet factory, where mitochondria turn gradients into motion, where protons walk downhill like pilgrims and ATP is minted in the soft clink of molecular coins, not because speed is needed, but because steadiness is. We imagine gills combing water for the invisible, filaments red with iron and heme, catching O2 and letting it go in time with muscles plea, a bargain made in countless capillaries that do not need names to be loyal. Maybe, maybe not. But when oxygen rises, metabolisms widen, and in that widening new tempos appear faster hunts, longer journeys, deeper burrows and sediments. Remember this, not in portraits but in patterns. Thicker bioturbation where life turned the seafloor like a gentle plough, more robust shells where energy budgets allowed heavier dreams, isotopes keep the ledger in whispers, carbon in biomarkers, leaning light after blooms, nitrogen growing heavy when recycling tightened in crowded seas, iron shifting states as redox lines walked the sediment, and we read those fractions like pulse and pressure measured across an epoch. We picture early hearts without chambers, peristaltic tubes working a simple rhythm, then valves learning to hold, to time, to trust the pause as much as the push, and the architecture of flow becomes an internal geography, branching rivers of blood, tracing the shortest paths to need. Could it be that identity sharpened when waste found exits and breath found entries, when inside and outside learned a disciplined exchange? Membranes choosing with kindness what to keep and what to release, not because purity was the goal, but because balance is softer than excess. Entropy does its faithful work, letting high-energy molecules slide toward ease, heat blooming as a byproduct that bodies learned to use or lose, and in rocks this appears as delicate films of ancient lipids, sterins and hopans, tucked into shales like pressed flowers of metabolism. Small, precise ghosts saying we were busy here. Subduction listens from below, taking the carbon of bodies and the sulfur of breath and carrying them into warmth, returning parts as volcanic sighs that feed the surface with the very ingredients. Life will list again in its recipes, and the circle turns without fatigue. We hold a tooth and think not of bite but of diet. Enamel recording oxygen that tells of water's temperature, strontium naming the basin, carbon telling whether the meals came from seagrass or open water, and we feel how a mouth can be a map when the jaw is quiet. Maybe the most tender evidence is a stromatolite's renewed patience beside a burrowed bed, two economies side by side, one built on light, one on motion, reminding us that energy has more than one accent and survival more than one grammar. The atmosphere adjusts its role, greenhouse quilts, warming currents, monsoons ferrying nutrients like seasonal letters, ozone holding the sun at arm's length, so cells can keep their delicate engines unburned, and shells learn to inscribe pH in their growth bands as if keeping a diary of comfort and strain. We imagine the first hemoglobins learning to cling less or more depending on acidity, the bore shift as a quiet agreement that hard work deserves easier breath, and we carry that logic into our own ribs without noticing, a half-billion-year courtesy passing down as reflex. Is it possible that memory in biology is mostly choreography, enzymes finding partners at the right moment, pathways choosing routes with less friction, networks calming storms by dispersing them, and that fossils, when they can, preserve only the stage, leaving us to infer the dance from footprints and dust? Maybe, maybe not, but the rock does keep some songs, organic layers rich enough to darken the page, vanadium and nickel tagging the presence of ancient chlorophylls, sulfur bound in pyrite, where respiration took a different road, and these signs together feel like breath written in mineral cursive. We listen for decay without disdain, microbes completing the circle, turning bodies into gradients that other bodies can climb, and in this generosity the planet prevents clutter and creates archives, the paradox of erasure that preserves currents move through us as much as around us, ions drifting across membranes, sodium and potassium trading places like tides, and the similarity to shore makes us smile in the dark, recognizing that a cell is a small coastline with rules the ocean taught, and yet, if the inner engines hum with such durable grace, if rocks can keep the exhalations of lives and the faint oils of their effort, what else might be stored in forms more fragile than bone? The soft scripts of nerves, the fleeting messages of hormones, the soundless decisions of cells that once changed everything and left only a trace of warmth in the stone. If forms more fragile than bone could store what mattered, the soft scripts of nerves, the fleeting messages of hormones, the soundless decisions of cells that once changed everything and left only a trace of warmth in the stone, then we arrive gently where sensation first learned to linger, where a spark became a signal, and a signal became a way to know. We picture early nerve nets spread like constellations beneath thin skin, not a brain yet, but a tide of excitations moving from touch to twitch, from light to shy retreat, sodium rushing in as potassium drifts out, a coastline drawn across a cell's edge that speaks in charges, not because drama asked, but because gradients were already waiting to be heard. Maybe, maybe not, but from these small storms comes a choreography of choosing, ciliated plates steering toward warmth, filaments, tasting chemistry the way a fingertip tastes the edge of a page, tiny bodies rewiring with experience until memory, at last, becomes more than chemistry and begins to wear a shape. We imagine hormones as letters passing between rooms, messages folded into molecules that travel slow rivers of fluid, cortisol and melatonin, long before their famous names, signaling stress and night, balance and readiness, and the sediment keeps none of these directly, yet it records their consequences in patterns of growth rings and pauses, in the thickness of shells born in lean years, and the width of burrows carved in seasons of ease. Isotopes whisper at the margins of this softness, carbon-bent light in pulses, matching blooms that fed neural hunger, nitrogen heavy, where recycling tightened in crowded shallows, oxygen in phosphates, of teeth and bone, when bones appear, holding the temperature of water that bathed a nervous system, learning to trust its own thresholds. Could it be that perception changed the geology of a place, creatures gathering under certain currents, where a path that hardens into trace fossils, predators and prey, carving mirrored signatures into silt, repeated roots layering until rock remembers a habit, the same way a mind remembers a lullaby? Entropy walks with mercy through these scenes, letting sparks die back into gradients, letting tissues decay into gradients. Other lives can read, and though nerves and hormones leave no direct fossils, biomarkers cling to shales, lipids and sterins like faint fingerprints of interior economies, and we read them as one reads a weathered note, carefully, gratefully, open to correction. Subduction hums its constant bassline beneath even this. Decisions made in the shallows carried slowly into heat. Signals turned back into elemental story, yet circons in ash above these waters keep time for the soft revolutions below, anchoring tenderness to a date. A billion nights will not blur. We rest a hand on a slab, cross-hatched by burrows, and feel the quiet invention of choice, the difference between random and remembered, a network doing just enough to keep the body between dangers, just enough to return for more, and in that enough, we hear the planet's ethic, not perfection, but persistence. Perhaps the first emotions were gradients, relief when oxygen found hemoglobin, unease when acidity rose, comfort when salt matched the inner sea, the body keeping counsel with itself in tides that never needed words, and the rocks keep the context. Evaporites hinting at salinity swings, black shales of anoxia when anxiety would have thickened, carbonates clear in times of balanced breath. We picture eyes as they sharpen, turning the ambient into direction, and with sight comes a reorganization of space. Reefs gain corners of safety and stages of display, flats become runways, canyons become corridors where signals echo along stone, and though nerves are dust by dawn, the architecture they chose persists in the sediment's prose. Maybe, maybe not, but even a quiet encampment leaves a smoke of isotopes, a faint drift in nitrogen or sulfur, where communities nested and fed, and we think of social signals forming, pheromones in the water like perfume of intention, alarms and invitations that pass invisibly, yet bend the geography of lives. The atmosphere listens, its oxygen, a ceiling that nerves depend on for their quicksilver speed, its carbon dioxide a throttle that tunes breath, and climate's longer rhythms lay a tempo beneath synapses, glacial pulses pacing migrations, monsoon cycles writing seasons into hormone clocks, all of it archived indirectly in deltas that wax and wane, in lows that blankets a continent with a memory of wind. We hold a trilobite trackway where steps stumbled and then steadied, an anecdote of learning pressed into stone, and imagine the small correction inside the animal, the nervous system adjusting gain, damping a tremor, rewarding a path that works with a peptide sigh, and we feel how behavior becomes geology when repeated long enough under a patient sky. Decay, as always, completes the circle without spite, turning neurotransmitters back into river food, turning endocrine whispers back into salts, yet leaving their echoes in growth patterns, in community textures, in the synchronized layers of reefs that spawn by moon and tide, a timing so exact it prints itself into the thickness of the year. And yet if feeling could change the map and chemistry could teach a body to wait, if nerves can orchestrate without leaving bones to testify, what other forms of memory lie beyond the animal entirely? What about the planet's own networks of habit and return, the climate loops and rock cycles that, like a mind, learn from feedback and sometimes tip, sometimes recover, sometimes forget, inviting us to listen for a larger kind of attention held in currents and clouds? If a larger kind of attention is held in currents and clouds, in loops that learn and sometimes forget, then we lean toward climate as a memory. The planet keeps with breath rather than books, a long, slow inhale of warmth and a careful exhale of cold, not because balance is guaranteed, but because feedbacks prefer conversation to command. We picture sunlight arriving as steady letters on the ocean's surface, albedo answering with brightness or shadow depending on ice, depending on cloud, and beneath that surface, the overturning begins, warm water flowing poleward along a patient's skin, cooled and salted water, sinking like a thoughtful stone, deep currents returning the favor. Centuries later, a global whisper that can be nudged by the smallest thumb on the scale, a freshwater pulse, a bloom, a basin narrowing, and we ask, what if memory is only the persistence of a pattern that expects to be continued? Maybe, maybe not. but the rock records these expectations in quiet alternations, limestones revealing calm light, shales telling of rich, oxygen-poor feasts, evaporites crystallizing the long thirsts of enclosed seas, and in each layer we hear a refrain. Rain fell, then paused, rivers carried, then rested, winds braided dust across an ocean that needed iron like a breath needs air, and the ratio ledgers of carbon and oxygen and nitrogen nod to confirm. We imagine ice as a gentle archivist, snow stacking into fern into crystal libraries where bubbles keep the exact gossip of air, CO2 and methane in tiny rooms that time forgot to scold, and the layered dust within counting distant deserts, counting winds that wandered farther when forests leaned or monsoons softened, and we hold an imagined core and feel winters and summers pulse through it like a heartbeat, too slow for one life, but perfect for many. Entropy helps here by smoothing chaos into signal, letting turbulence average into climate, letting 1,000 storms make one season, and 1,000 seasons make a cycle. The ocean can recall, while decay returns leaf and plankton to nutrients, so the system can rehearse its own song without hoarding. Could it be that tectonics sets the tempo beneath all this, continents drifting like quiet keys on a vast instrument, opening and closing gateways that change currents, raising mountain walls that pull moisture into snow, and send rivers against gravity until they surrender their bicarbonate to the sea, a debt later paid as limestone and eventually as breath at a volcano's open mouth? We sit with the slow grace of the carbon-silicate cycle, rain learning to be mild acid, rock consenting to dissolve into ions that ride to the sea, shells removing that carbon and tucking it into stone for long keeping, subduction asking for it back in warmth, outgassing giving it away again, an old kindness of recycling that keeps the sky from forgetting itself, not because foresight exists, but because chemistry repeats what works. Atmosphere composes with the ocean, water vapor writing soft accelerations, clouds deciding whether to shade or warm. Their droplets are politics of size and number, and in these choices we feel a mindless prudence, a kind of distributed attention that errs but also corrects. El Niño and La Niña, taking turns like a slow metronome that occasionally misses a beat but finds it again in the next bar. Isotopes keep quiet minutes. 18O in shells rising with cold, deuterium in ice, sinking with distance and chill, carbon in stalagmites swaying with vegetation's sway above, and we read these like the underlines in a book someone loved long ago, not authority, but devotion. Maybe the strangest proof of climate's memory is how life arranges itself in advance of a mood it has come to expect. Forests growing rings that match rainfall's long averages, reefs building higher where sea levels return as faithfully as tides, migratory routes inheriting wind and temperature, as if they were family stories, and though the rock will later erase the bodies, it will keep the patterns they performed. Subduction, always patient, carries entire weather systems into stone soots and salts clays that once held the odor of rain, pressing them into metamorphic light that later returns as mountains whose shapes reroute clouds, and we see how the loop grows thicker with every turn, a planet revising not only its pages but its margins and binding, not because change is crisis by default, but because change is the way information is kept. Perhaps memory also includes forgetting on purpose, unconformities where erosion insists on rest, where a land decides to nap under wind, where sediments wait for a river that has not yet formed, and these pauses simplify the text so that the next paragraph can begin without confusion. We watch as thresholds appear, ice that once it spreads reflects more light and invites more ice, forests that once thinned dry winds into harsher vowels, currents that once slowed carry less salt and slow more, and in these tilts we recognize the planet's version of mood, the way a system can fall into one song and linger there until something gentle but persistent, dust, orbit, uplift, nudges the needle to a new groove. Is it possible that identity at the scale of worlds is this? The capacity to keep playing while changing keys, to hold coherence without refusing revision. We press our ear to a cliff where valves stack like counted breaths, summer's pale silt, winter's dark stillness, and hear a lake practicing time year after patient year, until something abrupt, an outburst flood, a landslide, turns the metronome into a drum for a day, and then, like good memory does, returns to pulse with a broadened grace. And yet, if climate can keep its own counsel across eras, if oceans and clouds hold an attention wider than any single life, if stone can remember the soft arithmetic of seasons and the rare stutter of catastrophe, what other long conversations are we missing? The buried talks between mountain and rain, between dust and bloom, between magma and ice, that shape the stage so quietly we only notice when the script suddenly opens into a new act. What other long conversations are we missing? The buried talks between mountain and rain, between dust and bloom, between magma and ice, that shape the stage so quietly we only notice when the script suddenly opens into a new act. We lean into those whispers as if placing an ear against a long, warm wall, and at first there is only hush, then patterns, then the certainty that dialogue is everywhere, the mountain speaking in minerals lofted grain by grain, the rain answering in rivers that learn their curves by touch. We follow a drop from cloud to ridge to rill, not because a single journey explains the world, but because repetition turns water into a patient author, carving letters into granite that read as valleys centuries later, and each bend is a compromise, gravity asking, resistance negotiating, entropy smoothing the terms until both sides can rest. Dust rises from distant dryness like a memory unmoored, lifted by thermal hands across whole oceans to settle on a green hunger, iron falling onto blue deserts of water where plankton wait, and blooms emerge, not as spectacle but as relief, a quiet exhale that tucks carbon into drifting snow, and we wonder, could it be that fertility is a kind of courier service, ancient soils visiting empty rooms with gifts they never planned to give? Maybe not, but the isotopes nod along, nitrogen growing heavy where recycling tightens, carbon leaning light when feasts send their seconds to the deep, and in these shifts the sea keeps its ledger with a tenderness that forgives error by averaging it away. Magma speaks to ice without words or heat at first, pushing land upward until air thins and snow decides to stay, and glaciers reply in a slow grammar of abrasion and plucking, quarrying rock into fine flour that rivers later carry into bays where deltas build like soft tongues of time, and when the climate hesitates between moods, moraines mark the breath, a bead on the necklace of retreat. Subduction attends all this as a silent witness, pulling entire coasts under until water trapped in minerals is set free like old news, melting the mantle just enough to let volcanoes letter the sky with ash, and that ash returns as a timestamp in lake beds and ice, a gentle insistence that even fire can be part of a lullaby if we read it at the pace of centuries. We picture wind practicing the long geometry of dunes, grains hopping, settling, aligning into ridges that migrate with a stride too slow for a day, but exactly right for an age, cross beds tilting like pages turned by a careful hand, and somewhere beneath, a buried river channel holds a darker story, cut in wetter times and kept as a negative when the air chose a drier script. Atmosphere and ocean trade rumors along the equator, warm pools sliding east then west, pressure dipping its head in acknowledgement. El Niño, La Niña, an old conversation that feeds some shores and starves others, a seesaw whose creak is carved into corals as bands of density, and into stalagmites, as shifts of drip and pause, and we hold these chords as evidence that cycles are memory's favorite rhyme. Perhaps the most modest exchange is between root and stone, acids from fine hairs persuading feldspar to loosen its hold on potassium, mica to let go of its iron, and in that slow diplomacy soil thickens, clays form, landscapes learn to cradle forests that darken the ground, and cool the air by shade alone, and a slope becomes less a fall, and more a seat. Entropy is never absent, always easing gradients, always turning sharpness toward comfort, talus fanning out like a sigh, fan deltas braiding where flash floods loosen the mountain's jaw, and yet in this easing new structure appears, levees rising from repeated overflows, floodplains remembering which fields to spare, and which to claim. Fossils enter the dialogue as punctuation, a shell rising at low tide to become a gull's meal, then a shard, then grit, then cemented again in a conglomerate that records the violence without the malice, and soft-bodied traces thread through layers, where calm water held its breath long enough to keep a footstep, a feeding loop, a single turn of doubt pressed into mud. Could it be that identity at the scale of landscapes is an agreement between forces, uplift and downcutting, bloom and dust, freeze and thaw, each learning the other's timing until the dance leaves forms that feel inevitable afterward? We listen for isotope trails in rivers, strontium, naming the mountains that gave themselves oxygen, telling of the snowlines rise and fall, and these signatures converge downstream into a delta's wide mouth, where sediment fans into 1,000 thin tongues, each one a sentence about what the basin chose to say that year. The planet's memory keeps overlapping here, an old shoreline cut into bedrock high on a cliff, an abandoned meander now a crescent lake, where frogs inherit a channel's forgotten habit, a lava plain, cooled into hexagons that echo the ice's love of cracks, different temperatures finding the same solution to stress, and we feel how separate conversations sometimes arrive at matching shapes. Maybe, maybe not, but even silence speaks. A dry lake bed tiled in polygons of shrinkage, a salt pan that glows under moonlight, and holds the footfalls of night animals until dawn, erases them kindly, and in that erasure a new day's wind begins another letter to the far hills. And yet if these quiet exchanges have always been shaping the stage, if mountain and rain and dust and bloom and magma and ice have been writing to one another in gradients and grain sizes, what happens when the letters speed up, when something in the conversation changes pace, and the replies arrive too quickly or too late? How does the archive hold a rush, and what new forms appear when the planet tests how fast it can remember? When something in the conversation changes pace and the replies arrive too quickly or too late, when the letters speed up and the archive must hold a rush, we feel the planet inhale a little sharply, as if surprised by its own fluency, not because time forgot to be slow, but because feedbacks sometimes find a steeper slope, and gravity, chemistry, and light discover how easily a note can be carried forward. We imagine oxygen, once a patient invention, becoming a quiet revolution that keeps unfolding, rust spreading through iron-rich seas like dawn through fog, metabolisms shifting to use a richer flame, sediments dark and then light, as redox lines retreat into deeper rooms. And we ask, what if the quiet inventions of oxygen were never finished, only paused, resuming wherever a basin, a bloom, a breeze offers the right invitation? Maybe, maybe not. But we see oxygen as a tutor, teaching fire to behave in water, teaching cells to harvest steep gradients and return the gift as motion or thought, and rocks keep the lesson in small ways. Iron formations banded like music staves, black shales that thicken in anoxic interludes, the sudden clarity of carbonate platforms when breath becomes abundant enough to build. Isotopes note the tempo, carbon leaning light in prosperous blooms that pack away energy before decay can reclaim it, sulfur splitting its voices when microbes choose alternative doors in the absence of air, molybdenum growing generous in ocean water when oxygen polishes the deep, and the ledger reads like a poem of thresholds crossed and crossed again. We watch how oxygen encourages new materials, collagens that lace tissue to bone, chitin that armors small courage, enamel that keeps a meal's memory gleaming, and how these inventions cascade into landscapes, burrows that churn the seafloor until lamination is replaced by texture, reefs that rise and baffle waves into quieter lagoons, soils that deepen under forests that exhale in green vowels all afternoon. Subduction takes these changes down and returns them changed, carbonates into carbon dioxide, sulfur into strange partnerships, water freed from slabs to melt mantle into language. A volcano can speak, and the atmosphere listens, answering with blankets or veils depending on the mix, and climate steps into a new rhythm that life follows with a trust it can't explain. Could it be that the most radical shifts come not with impact but with permission, not because the world is forced, but because one invention opens a door that 1,000 small attempts walk through? Oxygen allowing muscles to travel, travel allowing predation, predation allowing speed, speed arranging nervous systems into maps that require steadier skies. Entropy is kind even here, smoothing the rush into workable gradients, teaching torrents to become rivers again, turning the sharp bite of novelty into a habit that sediments can store. And in this translation the planet protects itself from its own enthusiasm. We hold a piece of red bed and feel the shadow of air settled into it, iron oxidized under a sky that had learned restraint, and we think of ozone, another gift of oxygen, thin at first then thicker, a veil woven from sunlight that softens sunlight, an irony so tender it feels like a lullaby, protection born of exposure. Oxygen's quiet inventions are not only metabolic but cultural at the scale of cells, cooperation that depends on reliable breath, tissues that specialize because supply is steady, bodies daring to grow larger because diffusion is no longer a tight leash, and the archive answers with a chorus of forms that fill the shelves faster than forgetting can clear them. Maybe, maybe not, but even fast chapters know how to lean on deep ones. The carbon silicate cycle keeps its slow counsel, mountains rise at rates hearts can't feel, and ice sheaths return in patient intervals, reminding the loud pages that the book still prefers calm isotopes in tooth enamel. Preserve the warmth of waters that hosted these changes. Strontium tells the rivers that fed the seas where shells thickened. Uranium in corals watches sea level breathe, and we rid these quiet numbers to keep our pace even when the story hurries. We listen for the hush under the rush, the way black shales, when stacked, mean oxygen was busy above and absent below, the way dropstones in those shales mark a cold hand opening a warm door, the way pyrite framboids glint like a soft no to oxygen in corners where life chose another path. Atmosphere and ocean exchange promises. Oxygen supports ozone. Ozone protects the surface. Protection encourages photosynthesis on brighter shallows. More photosynthesis lifts oxygen further, and the loop tightens into a generosity that sometimes stumbles. Wildfires flare when air grows too forgiving. Nutrients run short when blooms overreach, and sediments record both gift and correction in alternating lines. Subduction, steady and unsentimental, stores away success and returns it as raw possibility, and we acknowledge that even the best inventions cycle back into ingredients, not because they failed, but because the world prefers reuse to regret. Perhaps the most human part of this chapter is how we feel the echo. Breath as inheritance, blood as a movable sea, our sleep a small rehearsal of planetary rhythms, mitochondrial hum as a household heirloom humming in every room, while the stone keeps a simpler truth. Oxygen leaves color, leaves minerals, leaves habits that make beaches from bones and mountains from reefs. And yet, if oxygen could teach stone to brighten and bodies to quicken, if a single element once rare could alter the archive's handwriting and the music's key, what happens when the light itself changes, when the sun's breath filtered through a newly woven sky invites surfaces to step closer and try again, not with armor first, but with language made of sugar and shade? When the sun's breath filtered through a newly woven sky invites surfaces to step closer and try again, not with armor first, but with language made of sugar and shade. We follow the leaf as it learns to speak to light, a grammar of chlorophyll and open pores, of water carried upward like a quiet hymn. We picture stomata opening at dawn like small polite mouths, trading vapor for carbon, and in that exchange the air is edited, CO2 lowered by a fraction, oxygen raised by a kindness, and the plant writes a sentence into the morning that stones will later remember as coal, as carbonates, as a pale sheen in ancient resin holding an insect's breath. Maybe, maybe not. but the forest becomes a patient machine for slowing light, stacking photons into wood that will bend a river, cool a slope, catch dust carried from far deserts, and each ring is a ledger of gentle negotiations, wet and dry, warm and cold, generous and lean, archived in patterns a thin blade can read. We stand in the understory and feel time soften, entropy slowed by lattice and fiber, decay waiting its turn with spores that hum under bark, ready to return the stored light to soil and air without accusation. And the soil thickens with memories of leaves, clay learning to hold water long enough for roots to drink without fear. Isotopes listen, carbon tilting light in leaves fed by sunlight, heavier in times when volcanoes spoke more loudly, oxygen in cellulose tracing seasons of rain and drought, deuterium in tree rings, whispering of storm tracks and snow lines. And these quiet signatures persist even when trunks are gone, passing into peat, into lignite, into the dark pages that coal will later open with a spark. Could it be that a canopy is a climate written in branches, a sky held lower to protect the ground, a breathing roof that alters wind and rain into slower instruments, and the geology below answers by changing color and chemistry, iron reddened by oxygen-rich waters, carbonates dissolving into rooms that drip stone back into air as stalactites, counting centuries with patient shine, subduction distant and steady, will take a forest's burial and return it as heat and gas in another age. And some of that breath will lace a cloud that shades a different leaf, the loop not moral but merciful in its reuse. We trace a long route to a rock, and find acids persuading feldspar to let go of potassium, mica to loosen iron, minerals weather into clays, clays cradle nutrients, nutrients re-enter veins as soft letters of instruction, and we feel how stone learns to become food without losing dignity. Maybe the most tender message of photosynthesis is its restraint, not because the sun is stingy, but because water is precious, and so stomata close at noon, open at dusk, a rhythm that inks a day into sugar and silence in equal parts. Fungi read this cadence, and weave understory networks, trading phosphorus for carbon, passing warnings like whispers along hyphal roads, and though no fossil keeps the script, the partnership lingers in the way a forest holds together after a wound, in how quickly green returns to a gap. Atmosphere listens with gratitude, ozone thick enough now to soften high notes, clouds forming earlier over dark canopies, rainfall more likely where forests beckon it back, and the record gathers in lake mud, pollen grains tiny and durable as beads, naming who stood here when the wind blew this way, and who left when it turned. We hold a leaf imprint in a slab, the veins like rivers mapping the plain, and behind it a coal seam hints at a swamp that swallowed its own seasons, oxygen high enough for insects to dream of size, and we ask whether abundance is a kind of courage or a kind of quiet risk. Isotopes in speleothems swing with forest breath above, carbon tracking how much leaf returned its gift to soil, oxygen revealing storms that came in warmer or colder clothes, and drip by measured, drip the cave keeps a diary, no fire can smudge, entropy keeps the cycle honest, wood rots, humus darkens, methane slips from wet hours, lightning returns a fraction of forest to the sky. In a flash the rain forgives, and ash feeds seedlings that calibrate leaf to light again, a reset that does not scold. We think of ancient wetlands laying peat under a ceiling of ferns and towering horsetails, and of later, drier ages when grasses learn to use carbon differently, C4 pathways tuning the mouth of the leaf to heat and scarcity, inscriptions of adaptation etched into the carbon ratio that Luz and Lake will carry forward. Could it be that photosynthesis is the oldest language we still speak without noticing? Breath in, breath out. A poem that begins in the chloroplast and ends wherever a muscle lifts a hand. The inheritance of a billion mornings. Subduction mutters beneath, adjusting plates so mountains rise to catch rain, that rivers deliver to leaves, and the same rivers carve floodplains, where forests lay codas of pollen in light and dark bands that a patient core will later recite. And yet, as day folds itself into bluish shade, and the canopy hushes its mouths, the leaf's sugars move downward to roots that feed the dark, fungi, microbes, small lives that never see the sun, but spend its earnings wisely, and we are reminded that every gift the light gives is completed in shadow. And if sugar and shade can build a continent of calm, if pollen and resin can outlast the hands that held them, if wood can memorize weather and hand it to stone, what else does the night keep for the day? What silent metals, what moon-pulled tides of groundwater, what hidden clocks inside minerals, waiting to be turned gently, so the next page can open without a sound? What silent metals, what moon-pulled tides of groundwater, what hidden clocks inside minerals are waiting to be turned gently, so the next page can open without a sound? We lower our thoughts into the aquifer where water moves slower than a story and learns the shape of stone by heart. Calcium borrowed from limestone, magnesium from dolomite, silica gathered from patient sands, each iron a small memory of contact, and in this dark river, tides from a distant moon lift and settle pressure like a sleeping breath. Maybe, maybe not. But we feel the planet's pulse in wells that rise a finger's width at night, in springs that brighten when the sea is full, in caves that drip in rhythms too calm for clocks, and every drop writes a ring of calcite that remembers temperature, remembers rain, remembers the long argument between drought and cloud. Without taking sides, isotopes carry the lanterns, oxygen in speleothems swaying with storm tracks and season, carbon telling how forests above were breathing, strontium naming the bedrock that taught the water its minerals, and we read these bright numbers the way one listens for the key of a song in a quiet room. We turn a small crystal and watch its colors change between crossed lights, interference revealing a hidden fabric, strain locked in quartz, twins in feldspar like quiet scars, zoning in zircon, where uranium decayed to lead in nested rings of time. And we ask, what if minerals dream in half-lives, their lullaby, a countdown soft enough to last 1 billion nights? Subduction sits beneath the scene like a low kindness, guiding fluids out of sinking slabs, releasing water that melts a small portion of mantle into language. A volcano can speak, and that speech becomes ash that settles into lakes and ice as a timestamp, a gentle insistence that even fire can be part of a memory kept in coolness. We follow groundwater along a fault where pressure drops and gases slip free, and the rock whistles in bubbles so fine you can only hear them in how the water tastes, a mineral brightness that marks a doorway between rooms, and we imagine metals walking these cracks, iron darkening to ochre, manganese leaving lilac ghosts, copper whispering blue-green into a seam, an alchemy without wizards, only gradients doing what gradients do. Entropy is patient here, annealing lattice strain in warm rocks, letting defects migrate until crystals relax, smoothing histories into clarity while keeping a residue of the path. Exsolution lamellae like quiet writing across a feldspar's face, a record of chill and comfort that no storm can smear. Maybe the moon's gentlest work is underground, perigee nudging aquifers to breathe, microsisms purling through bedrock like distant surf, grains shifting a fraction, faults deciding to wait, and the waiting becomes safety that no surface eye can praise. We stand in a karst chamber where the roof glitters with time flowing downward, stalactites counting in pale columns, stalagmites answering from below, and columns meeting like two sentences that finally share a verb. And in the meeting the cave's air steadies enough to preserve a pollen grain, an ember of a forest that no longer stands. Could it be that technofossils began long before us in the way microbes plated iron onto their walls, and left banded iron formations like magnetic hymns, in the way mats trap dust to raise their own rooms, in the way termite mounds and reef frameworks rewrote wind and water for miles around, structures born of intention without plans, design expressed as persistence, atmosphere listens down the cracks, pressure changes tugging at pores so subtly that gases move the length of a field in a day, radon rising before certain slips not as a warning, but as a habit of physics, and the rock absorbs the news with the calm of something that has always known more than it says. Isotopes tick in tiny archives we almost miss, fluid inclusions sealed in quartz with the exact salinity of a vanished sea, helium building in zircon as uranium loses its urgency, argon closing into mica when the temperature falls below a certain kindness. And these closures are doors we can date, doors that let us walk hallways where no foot has ever been. Perhaps the loneliest clocks are in permafrost where ice beads hold air that soils once breathed, nitrogen and argon and faint perfumes of an ancient summer, and when thaw comes it is not a crime but a confession, a release of stories that must learn a new shelf. We place a hand on a basalt column cooled into hexagons by shrinking heat and feel the echo of a lake's winter skin. Different causes, same geometry. Stress choosing repetition because repetition is the safest way to share. Dust drifts in from far deserts and mineralizes clouds, giving droplets a spine, and rain falls more easily over a forest that called it, and below, the aquifer takes the gift and writes it into the clarity of a spring that will rise months later, as if the present were patient enough to include the past. Maybe, maybe not, but the impression remains that metals, waters, and lattices keep time for one another without jealousy, iron rusting to tell oxygen's mood, calcite dissolving to open a path, quartz enduring to anchor a measure, and in their cooperation a landscape learns to hum at a frequency that sleep can hear. And yet, if these hidden clocks can fold darkness into order, if moon and mineral can share a schedule, if water can keep a diary for stone, what becomes of the chapters that move sideways through time, those fragments carried in error, and kept by accident, the erratics and out-of-place messages that suggest the archive sometimes scatters itself on purpose, inviting us to wonder whether memory travels as well as it rests. If the archive sometimes scatters itself on purpose, inviting us to wonder whether memory travels as well as it rests, then we walk with the wanderers, the erratics set down by vanished ice, the pebbles inside conglomerates far from any parent cliff, the fossils ferried by rivers into mouths of deltas, where they wait in patience for a reader who has not yet arrived. We imagine a boulder the size of a house asleep on a plain of bedrock. It does not match, granite resting on limestone like a star fallen into a field, and we feel the slow hand that carried it, a glacier's palm, cold and sure, moving it inch by inch until melt uncurled its fingers and left the stone as a misplaced sentence that still makes sense. Maybe, maybe not. But the ocean keeps its couriers too, rafts of vegetation, pumice blown by storms, shells hollowed by chance, and turned into boats too small to notice, and in their wake genes change continents quietly, a pollen grain crossing latitudes on the back of a wind, a seed lying in brackish sleep until sand agrees to host it. Isotopes reveal these journeys when eyes cannot, strontium in teeth naming the distant rock that fed a valley child, neodymium in dust, telling which desert visited a bloom, oxygen in a shell recalling the water from a different shore, and we read these riddles until paths appear, where maps show only blue. Subduction gathers the scattered later, dragging errant pages into warmth, and binding them into new chapters. Semounts sutured to continents, exotic tyrannies stitched along faults like patches on an old beloved coat, and mountain belts rise with accents from faraway crusts, telling a story of collision where friendship persists after impact. Entropy blesses the scatter, talus shedding from cliffs, pebbles rounding as they roll, rivers learning to sort by size, so that bars and beaches sing in alternating textures, cross-bedded tongues pointing downstream like gentle arrows for anyone who cares to follow, and in this sorting a logic emerges that the hand can trust without sight. Perhaps the kindest scatter is glacial till, unsorted, honest, a pocketful of everything left by the last cold breath, clays and cobbles, fossils and fragments waiting together, and within it a lone dropstone punched into quiet mud at sea, the bruise still visible in a shale that remembers how ice visited warmth for a moment. and then withdrew without apology. Could it be that technofossils began with drifting, with beaver dams that rework entire watersheds, with reefs that export their bones as beaches hundreds of kilometers away, with microbial mats that send flakes into the wind like spores of stone, design expressed not as blueprint but as diaspora? Atmosphere smiles at the scatter, moving dust like a librarian, moving notes between shelves, Sahara iron arriving over Amazon green, monsoon rains, answering with louder leaves, and the isotopes nod again. Carbon in tree rings lightening when far minerals feed a forest. Calcium in corals hinting at rivers from storms that began a world away. We hold a conglomerate and feel the company it keeps. Rounded chert, next to jasper, next to quartzite. Each a biography condensed to touch, each telling of a different mountain and the patience required to become smooth enough to share a matrix without argument. And in that piece we learn what time asks of sharpness. Maybe, maybe not. But fossils travel too. A bone reworked into a younger bed, a shell bored and rebedded, a tooth carried by a predator to a den, where species mingle in a kindness of confusion. And the record says not error but community. A place where lives intersected in ways the rock refuses to sort cleanly. Subduction even here, writes a postscript. Blocks of ocean floor mistaken for land. Ophiolites lifted and draped across mountains to remind us that seas can become ceilings. Pillow basalts glistening, in alpine sun like memories wearing new weather. And we ask whether location is ever final in a world that keeps rearranging its rooms. Isotopic clocks forgive the shuffle by holding the ages within. Zircon cores older than their host rock like elders carried into a festival of new lava, lead and helium ticking undisturbed beneath the chaos of movement. And these durable hearts let us anchor floating stories to a sequence that does not drift. Entropy closes the day with its slow mercy, scattering light at sunset the way rivers scatter stone, red wavelengths traveling farther, the sky becoming a gradient that replays the lesson of transport in color, and we breathe with it, understanding that travel is not noise but another way of being kept. And yet if memory can move and still be memory, if boulders can sleep far from home and remain true to their birth, if dust can cross oceans to feed a forest that will later feed a cave with carbon stories, what then of the pages that never move at all, the clocks sealed in crystal hearts, the fixed pulses inside zircons and clays? How do we sit with the stillness that times the wandering and gives it meaning without ever taking a step? If clocks sealed in crystal hearts time the wandering and give it meaning without ever taking a step, then we sit with stillness as a teacher. A small zircon under a lens holding more nights than any forest, more summers than any sea, uranium letting go in half-lives so steady that doubt grows quiet. We imagine a magma chamber cooling somewhere deep, zircon grains crystallizing like precise thoughts, trace elements slipping into their lattice according to rules that feel almost polite. Hafnium welcomed, lead refused until decay insists, and the crystal closes its doors the way a home closes curtains at dusk, not because the world is unwelcome, but because memory needs darkness to keep its light. Maybe, maybe not. But when the rock rises in a mountain long after, when weather writes its slow alphabet across ridges, the zircon rides out the edits, a fixed pulse inside a page that keeps being revised, and we place it in a beam that counts its isotopes like prayer beads, each ratio a bead warmed by an almost ancient hand. Feldspar carries a gentler clock, argon escaping until a threshold of cool allows it to stay, mica closing like an eyelid when the day is done. And from these closures we learn the time of warmth, the time of rest, the time when mountains stopped growing tall and began to listen for rain. Could it be that minerals know seasons we cannot feel, not spring and autumn but metamorphic weather? Garnet zoned in rings like a tree, each growth a chemical climate, each boundary a wind shift of pressure and heat. And if so, is identity in stone not an essence, but a diary of the conditions it survived? Subduction respects these diaries with a stern kindness. erasing some, preserving others, folding old clocks into new rocks where their cores remain as elders and their rims learn the names of later fires, and the mountain that returns will speak both languages at once, ancient and recent without contradiction. Isotopes hold the quiet line even when landscapes wander. Neodymium, leaning old or young according to the crust that fed a sediment. Strontium writing which river wrote the water into a shell. Oxygen in quartz whispering the temperature of a metamorphic room where no eye has ever opened. And we follow these threads like the softest of trails, trusting them because they do not hurry. Entropy participates without malice, annealing lattice wounds, encouraging exsolution to draw pale lamellae across feldspar, like notes on staff paper, relieving stress in ways that record the relief. And we learn that healing, too, can keep a date. A crystal's inclusion is a pocket watch, the brine sealed in quartz with the exact salt of a vanished sea, a bubble that expands under a needle of heat and shrinks again, telling us the pressure where it slept and the temperature of its dreams, and we marvel that a drop can be faithful for so long without seeking applause. Perhaps the stillest clocks are buried in clays that settle in lakes too calm for waves, valves stacking summer's silt over winter's hush in thin unbroken couplets, each pair a whisper of a year that did not shout, and when an earthquake slurs the pattern for a day, the slur becomes a bookmark that a century later we can find without waking anything. Atmosphere lays a lighter timing over these heavy measures, cosmogenic isotopes accumulating in high rocks like the soft dust of starlight, beryllium and chlorine counting exposure the way frost counts evenings on an alpine shoulder, and when the ice withdraws these clocks begin cleanly, as if the world forgave the years spent under a white hand. Could it be that stillness is not the opposite of motion but its frame, the way a heartbeat needs the quiet between beats to be heard, the way a river needs a bank to learn its curve, and the way our own days need a margin where we do nothing so that what we have done can become a shape? We hold a thin section to the polarizing light and watch colors bloom and fade with a turn, interference painting order out of ordinary, and the stone reveals a choreography of angles we would never guess from its gray in the field, and we understand that silence hides not absence but arrangement. Subduction closes the page gently, carrying clocks into warmth where some will reset and some will keep, and the keeping is not defiance but continuity, a way for time to thread itself through revision so that meaning does not break, even when matter does. Maybe, maybe not, yet every fixed pulse we find, the helium taught in zircon, the argon sealed in mica, the lead where uranium once sat lowers the noise in our own thinking, reminding us that a planet wide enough to forget is also wide enough to remember exactly, and that both can be merciful. And yet if stillness can measure motion without leaving its chair, if crystals can hold the ages in their small bright rooms while mountains move around them like weather, what then of the moments when the clock and the world stumble together, when a shock resets the lattice, when a pulse stops and restarts? How does the archive carry those hesitations, those near misses, those gentle breaks that teach a new rhythm without erasing the song? When a shock resets the lattice, when a pulse stops and restarts, how does the archive carry those hesitations, those near misses, those gentle breaks that teach a new rhythm without erasing the song? We listen for the fracture's soft syllable, the moment a rock takes a different path and still keeps its name. A fault ceiling with quartz that grew from warm waters in the dark, a mica clock reopened by a tremor and closed again as if a blink could be dated. Maybe not, but even disruption has handwriting, shatter cones radiating from a point where pressure arrived faster than thought, shocked quartz with plainer lines like delicate staff paper drawn by lightning held in stone, glassy tektites flung from a wound and cooled mid-air into drops that later settle like punctuation across continents. Entropy, our patient editor, rounds the violence into coherence, breccias cemented by the very fluids the break invited, angular fragments learning to lean on one another until they become a single voice again, and gouge ground to clay that slides kindly where sharpness once cut. Isotopes step gently through the confusion. Argon lost and then retained leaves a discordia line that still finds the rendezvous of ages, Lead in zircon rims records a second fire wrapped around an older heart. Helium's slow escape writes a new half-life's beginning without insulting the old. We picture a landslide that paused mid-slope and then moved again after rain. Its first sentence slurred into the second, but both preserved in the lobe where boulders rest atop fines, a grammar of gravity that a river will later translate into terraces, stepping down the valley like careful thoughts. Subduction folds hesitation into structure, an accretionary wedge where seafloor scraps and trench sediments tangle but keep their textures. Melange as a formal word for a kind of mercy, and serpentinite smeared along a fault becomes a green slip of peace that lets motion happen without shouting. Could it be that climate has stutters we can read, valves blurred by a single storm that broke the winter's dark with a rush of silt, ice layers in cores that hold ash from a year? The sun wore a different veil, tree rings tightened by a summer that arrived late and left early, each irregularity a tenderness rather than a flaw. We hold a metamorphic rock and see garnet zoning interrupted, a growth ring cut by a crack, later healed with quartz, chemistry picking up again a shade to the left as if the crystal took a breath before speaking on. And in that breath we hear a resilience that does not deny the fracture. Atmosphere writes its corrections, cosmogenic nuclides reset when ice withdraws, exposure clocks beginning anew as if a glacier's hand were an eraser with a soft tip, and dunes that migrated one way for centuries suddenly turn when wind learns a new refrain, crossbeds recording the pivot like a wrist that remembers both directions. Maybe the deepest hesitations are biological, reef frameworks toppled by a storm, and then rebuilt by larvae that smell their elders in the rubble. Burrow networks collapsed and redrawn a meter to the side, ecosystems that falter, and then, without fanfare, resume with a slightly altered chord, and the rock holds both arrangements in alternating layers like verses of a patient hymn. Isotopes in speleothems mark a drip that sped up for a decade, slowed for two, sped again, oxygen telling storm tracks that detoured and returned, carbon revealing how the forest above argued with fire, and then made peace, and the calcite keeps the debate as a series of clear lines no flame can smudge. We imagine impact nights when sky and stone spoke too quickly, craters filling with lakes that became laboratories of recovery, sediments settling in calm circles over shocked basements, and in those circles life wrote its forgiveness in diatoms and pollen, a gentle overlay on a violent page. Entropy finishes each interruption with a lullaby, stress diffused by dislocation creep, microcracks sealed by time and heat, colloids flocculating in still water until clarity is possible again, not because perfection is owed, but because systems prefer rest after effort, subduction steady as ever, swallows even the stutters, recycling confusion into clarity until the returned mountain holds a quiet seam that only a careful hammer and a kinder eye can find, and we accept that the archive is a palimpsest that refuses despair. Could it be that identity itself is a series of nearly broken continuities, a story that survives by changing pace, by resetting without surrendering, by letting clocks restart and still call it one time? We lay a palm on a healed fracture and feel its cool straightness through the rough wall, a line like a thought we almost lost and then recovered, and we think of our own pauses, breaths between words, sleeps between days, and how the world has always made room for them. And yet, if hesitations can be held without shame, if shocks can be archived without elevating noise, if resets can teach a new rhythm that stones and shells consent to remember, what else does the record carry that we have not learned to hear? The faintest arrivals of endings themselves, the slow rehearsals of absence before extinction step onto the stage and the chorus thins to silence so gentle it sounds like sleep. If the faintest arrivals of endings are carried in the record, slow rehearsals of absence before extinction step onto the stage, and the chorus thins to silence, so gentle it sounds like sleep, then we listen for the soft diminish, the way diversity tapers in layers long before a final line, shells fewer and thinner, burrows shallower, pollen spectra narrowing like a palette put away after a long afternoon. Not because drama prefers the last act, but because systems tire, nutrients shuffle, climates lean, and thresholds gather like evening at the edge of a field. We imagine oceans losing breath in warm centuries, anoxic tongues reaching upslope while reefs fall quiet, black shales thickening in patient increments, as if the sea were saving carbon instead of conversation. And we ask, what if extinctions begin, not with a shout but with a lull, a silt of delays that settles over habits until habits forget how to be themselves? Maybe, maybe not, but isotope trails go thin and then sharp, carbon dipping light when blooms overreach and sink, sulfur splitting more decisively as redox lines march inland, oxygen in shells telling of fevered waters or sudden chills, and these curves read like sighs on paper, small rises and falls that stacked together predict a hush. Entropy participates without malice. Food webs simplify, energy takes fewer paths from sun to silt, resilience, once broad, narrows into a single lane, and a storm that would have passed lightly now reorganizes a coast, leaves fewer builders to rebuild. Subduction is present like a patient witness, returning volcanism at inconvenient hours, ash-veiling skies, acid rain, etching tender leaves, basalt provinces exhaling long, slow burdens of carbon and sulfur, the kind of persistence that doesn't mean to be cruel, and yet teaches oceans to forget their mixing for a while. We hold a bone bed where many small deaths gathered in one season, a river's elbow catching what the valley could not keep, and we feel the logistics of loss, the way water sorts size and hope, large downstream, delicate tucked in eddies, an archive of a day that was not unusual until, in hindsight, it was part of a choir of such days. Could it be that identity falters when the rehearsal time shortens, when generations meet conditions shifting faster than memory can absorb, when lava drift toward cues that no longer match the world, and rock keeps this mismatch as absence, as a missing design in a familiar bed? Atmosphere writes its version too, greenhouse thickening or thinning beyond familiar modes, monsoons missing their cue, winds hemming blooms into regions that exhaust their trace iron, and stalagmites record the negotiations drip by drip, oxygen swinging wider, carbon marking the forest's pause before it tries again. Maybe the last witnesses are trackways that end mid-slope, burrows that halt in fresh silt, nests abandoned under a thin ash that kept the shape of an afternoon forever, and the tenderness of that shape invites us to read slowly, to breathe with the page and not rush its ache. Yet even endings nourish. Decay returns wealth to the ledger. Opportunists arrive. Small generalists thread new connections in thinner webs, and sediments write a lean prose that is not lesser, only different, leaving the wide lyric for another era that will learn its harmonies by degrees. Isotopes help us hear recovery too. Carbon rising heavier as burial slows, sulfur's fork closing as oxygen finds its footing, strontium shifting with the uplift of new coasts that rivers rush to meet, and the graphs relax like shoulders after a long weather. Subduction closes the scene with its stern kindness, making space for new basins, raising arcs where rain can restart old conversations with rock, and groundwater begins again to carry the patient news of stone to seed. Perhaps the quietest truth is that extinction is also editing, a revision that spares nothing but promises room, and the fossil record honors both loss and renewal, by never choosing a single tense, by speaking in layers where absence and arrival share a line. We run a thumb along an unconformity and feel missing years slip under our nail, not because time is careless, but because forgetting is part of remembering at any scale that hopes to go on. And yet if endings can arrive like dusk and leave like dew, if silence can bloom before it deepens and then thin out to make way for different songs, what else might the planet be practicing in its pauses, the strange tender beginnings that hide inside the aftermath, the small experiments that learn to write in margins until the margins become the page? If the planet is practicing strange tender beginnings that hide inside aftermath, small experiments that learn to write in margins until the margins become the page, then we enter the hush after weather, after ash, after water pulls back. and watch simplicity try the world on again. We picture ponds that were not there a season ago, warm and mineral sweet, bubbles climbing like shy thoughts. And in those shallows membranes gather themselves from chance, lipids closing into circles that keep a little order from spilling, not because destiny waits, but because boundaries are restful. Maybe, maybe not, but clays on the shore offer crowded surfaces where molecules meet more often than luck, a lone Montmorillonite handing out seats in a quiet theatre where nucleotides line up and whisper, and we wonder if memory began as a place to sit, a ledger of who arrived and who stayed long enough to link hands. Isotopes hum in the background even here, carbon leaning light, where sunlight teaches sugar anew, nitrogen growing heavy, where recycling tightens in small worlds, oxygen in phosphates, remembering the water's warmth when a fragile chain first borrowed energy from a gradient and called it life for an afternoon. Subduction keeps a distant vigil, lifting arcs that catch rain and scatter minerals into basins, balancing the recipe, iron from dust, phosphorus from rock, zinc and copper singing, in trace notes that enzymes will later ask for by name, and the atmosphere, softened by ozone and steadier by the long patience of forests and seas, becomes a kind of field where trials can fail without ending the story. Entropy is not the villain of these starts, it is the reason starts must keep eating, must keep mending, must keep choosing over and over, and in that repetition identity takes its first breath, not as a triumph but as a habit. Autocatalysis turning accident into custom, a loop that remembers itself because it is pleasing to continue. We listen for fossils that do not yet exist and find instead textures of presence, wrinkle marks, where mats will someday spread again, tiny pyrite that grows where oxygen still hesitates, evaporate rims that record the pause of a long afternoon. And we accept that the earliest chapters of any recovery are written in chemistry before they are written in bodies. Could it be that life prefers edges when starting over, shorelines between fresh and salt, vents between cold and hot, ice fringes where brine pockets hold concentration like a careful hand, and the record honors these borders by keeping their minerals closer, their crystals finer, their stories shorter but clearer. We think of techno-fossils in a wider sense, signs of intention without machines, channels cut by beavers that redirect whole wetlands, termite palaces ventilated with physics, microbial palimpsests that steer sediments, and we hear in them a chorus that says technology is any pattern that persists beyond a life, any habit that edits a landscape gently into cooperation. Atmosphere answers the new music in modulations of cloud and rain, monsoons returning along paths traced by leaves that have not yet grown, and stalagmites take dictation drip by drip, carbon tilting with the breath of a forest that is still assembling its lungs. Maybe, maybe not, but under a thin moon we imagine a strand line filmed in dew, and in that dew a molecule copies itself with mistakes kind enough to invite difference but not so many as to cancel tomorrow, and we feel the kindness in that ratio, the mercy of almost correct. Isotopes in lake mud will later reveal the timing of this patience. Deuterium swaying with storms, carbon rising as peat, learns to keep a secret, sulfur narrowing its split as oxygen finds depth again, and the layers stack not as proof of success but as proof of trying. Subduction, steady and unsentimental, will swallow some of these trials and return their parts as air and ash in a different century, a reminder that beginnings are not hoarded but loaned, circulated by a planet that dislikes corners where wealth pools too long. We rest beside a basalt flow where rain has found its cracks and ferns explore with small green hands, rhizoids tasting the glass for minerals, the way tongues test a tooth, and in this quiet appetite we hear the low rhyme that always follows silence. Take, turn, return. Could it be that memory at these times is mostly communal, a property of many small lives touching, failing, repeating, until the touch itself becomes architecture, reefs from mouths, soils from roots, currents from swims, and the archive begins to fill with shapes again. We hold a pebble that was once dust, that was once feldspar, that was once melt, that was once mantle, and we feel the comfort of reuse, the anti-drama of cycles that let beginnings arrive, pre-stocked with history, and yet, if margins can become pages and afterlives can become preludes, if chemistry can gather itself into breath under a sky that learned to be gentle, what else might be learning us even now, in places we forget to watch, the slow tutoring of dunes and tides and ice on our own memory, the way we too might practice starting over without noise, and find that what returns is quieter, kinder, and ready to listen. If what returns is quieter, kinder, and ready to listen, then we too slow our breath and trace the long math of becoming, the way change prefers a whisper to a shout, a ratio to a decree, a drift to a break. We picture evolution not as a ladder but as weather, genes shifting like dunes under a steady wind, small grains moving often, large shapes moving rarely, and in that patience novelty appears the way dawn does, gradually, then all at once, not because fate arranges it, but because chance finds a rhythm and selection keeps the beat. Maybe not, but we watch mutation as a soft painter laying thin glazes, most strokes drying clear, a few catching light just enough to be kept, and the kept become habits, enzymes that work a breath faster, pigments that quiet a predator's eye, bones that grow with a wiser curve, and sediments remember this as texture, more burrows where lives dared to deepen, thicker shells where energy allowed heavier choices, traceways that straighten when motion becomes intention, isotopes keep the tempo beneath the notes, carbon leaning light in errors that stored more breath underground, oxygen in phosphates recalling the waters that tutored teeth and bone, nitrogen rising heavy, where ecosystems tightened their recycling until opportunity sparked new diets, and we read these shifts like a metronome hidden behind the stage. Subduction, always the long hand on the clock, resets the experiment's ground rules without malice, raising mountains that write rain into maps, opening gateways that teach currents new paths, and life hears these edits as invitations rather than threats, not because it is brave, but because persistence is its only grammar. Entropy participates without scolding, easing sharp edges into forms that cost less to keep, curving claws until they fit their work, rounding river stones until they flow with less complaint. And in this soft accounting, the world becomes more efficient without becoming less tender. Could it be that identity is an average held over time, a melody composed of many small notes that sometimes wander and sometimes return, and that species are simply ways of remembering a useful tune until the room changes, and the tune learns a new key? Fossils show this not as leaps but as overlaps, old forms sharing beds with new experiments, mosaics of features that look like questions answered halfway, feathers warming before they flew, fins bearing weight before they walked, and rock keeps the ambiguity with kindness, allowing us to sit in the middle and feel the tug from both shores. Atmosphere nods along, oxygen steady enough to permit warm metabolisms, carbon wandering within bounds that forests and seas can coax back towards center, and climate, like a good partner, holding a tempo that bodies can memorize into migration and sleep, into spawn and seed, into hibernation and bloom, maybe not. But even when tempo stumbles, recovery rehearses the same patient tools, diversity spreading risk, redundancy catching dropped threads, networks reweaving around wounds, and in core after core we see the pattern, thin bands that widen again, quiet that finds its voice by degrees, isotopes in coral heads count seasons of resilience, strontium and uranium, murmuring sea level and growth, oxygen swinging with monsoons that return after detours, and the polyp's limestone diary proves that long life at small scale is a science of repeating what works and forgiving what fails. Subduction closes the loop by returning old scaffolds as ingredients, reefs to limestone to mountain to dust that feeds a new sea, and the planet's thrift saves us from drama. No finish line, just cycles that prefer reuse to regret. We hold a trilobite's molt, a cast-off suit that says becoming is a matter of shedding, as much as making, the body leaving a version of itself behind so the next version can fit, and we recognize the lesson tucked in chitin. Growth is a series of gentle betrayals of what once worked. Entropy writes the same message in dunes that slip a grain at a time, in glaciers that slide a breath a day, in soils that thicken by leaf and root, until a hillside can carry more life with less flood, and we feel how improvement at Earth's pace is indistinguishable from care. Could it be that the most elegant inventions arrive where cost is lowest? Photosystems tuned to dim light, enzymes saving a single ATP, and therefore a life over many winters, social insects building cities out of rules no longer than a whisper, and that complexity is not extravagance, but thrift braided into pattern. We tilt a thin section and see a foraminifer's house, luminous in cross-polarized calm, a spiral calculated by a tiny accountant who never used a number, and still balanced the ocean's books for millions of years, and we accept that elegance does not require an audience. Maybe, maybe not, but when change accelerates, even the long math tries to hold its place, plasticity stretching norms, epigenetic marks, lending a cushion to young bodies, learning a new climate, migrations moving ranges like careful furniture, and the rock will remember these attempts as rearranged pollen, as bones found a little higher or lower than expected, as a sudden thickness of shells where refuge gathered. Atmosphere answers with its own calculus, clouds forming earlier over darkening forests, monsoons shifting with warmed seas, and caves counting drips that speed and slow as if the hill were listening. And yet if becoming is mostly a kindness repeated, if deep time prefers revisions to revolutions, if the planet writes resilience as budgets and balances rather than banners, what waits in the quiet arithmetic we haven't solved, the technofossils of civilizations we've never met, the small signatures of intention that might hide like ratios in stone, asking whether memory itself is older, wider, and more curious than our brief stay can measure. If memory itself is older, wider, and more curious than our brief stay can measure, then we soften our voices and wonder how intention might hide in stone, how technofossils could be quieter than metal, patterns woven into chemistry, rhythms etched into ratios, signatures distributed like stars that only resolve when we step back. We imagine a civilization that spoke in durable alterations of cycles, not because it sought monuments, but because function was its lasting art, carbon drawn down and stored in mineral forms that look like ordinary rock, until isotopes lean together in a way seasons alone would never choose, nitrogen pathways rerouted so subtly that soils keep the echo long after names are gone. Maybe, maybe not, but we look for improbable correlations, trace metals lifted from background to chorus in distant basins at the same breath of time, magnetic grains aligned against prevailing winds as if a field once hummed with one more instrument. Pollen records pulsing with crops that never quite match climate's cue, and we ask, what if technology is any habit that outlives its maker and teaches stone a new refrain? Subduction, steadfast librarian, would still shelve most pages in warmth, yet edges escape. River deltas burying deliberate sediments beneath honest floods, ice cores trapping tiny aerosols that repeat in intervals too regular for weather, lake valves spelling out an arithmetic of abundance, and pause that hints at calendars without words. Isotopes keep their unromantic watch, carbon easing lighter in stacked years when photosynthesis was helped beyond sunlight's gift, sulfur splitting narrower where oxygen held steady in waters that should have strained, neodymium and strontium pointing to quarries moved across basins, fingerprints of distance nested inside mud that otherwise reads like patience. Entropy edits as always, smoothing spires into humps and alloys into oxides, but intention, if it ever settled here, would choose forms that survive smoothing, geometry that returns after weather, ratios that regenerate even as materials dissolve, a choreography of flows that restores itself after interruptions, as if taught to the river rather than carved by it. Could it be that the planet itself is a medium that favors soft inscriptions, signals written into cycles rather than objects, into tides and trees, and the timing of blooms, a message legible only when read across many rooms at once. And we, who love single artifacts, are still learning to listen to choirs. We hold a core and feel the humility of scales. Our centuries a few dark grains, their centuries a gentle cambium of silt, and somewhere in the stack a brief bright anomaly, platinum dust from a rare sky day, or spheres of melted sand whispering impact. But the deeper intrigue is in the long, disciplined nudges that require no catastrophe, only intention repeated until geology adopts it as temperament. Atmosphere keeps its diary in quiet sways, methane trimmed to narrow valleys, not because wetlands changed, but because someone learned to guide decay. Ozone spared its scars by emissions that never rise beyond rumor, and the ice remembers smoothness where natural teeth should be, accumulation curves that breathe like a practiced singer rather than a winded choir. Maybe, maybe not. But technofossils could also be ecological architectures, reefs encouraged in fractal lattices that persist as limestone long after designers forgot themselves, mangrove margins arranged to break waves into safer mathematics, dune fields tuned with planted roughness, whose pattern remains when roots are dust, a geometry the storm respects. Subduction would test every claim, and so would time. Yet some residues pass the trial, glass turned to palagonite that still holds a recipe in trace impurities, ceramics in caves, learning to mimic stalagmites while keeping a crystalline grammar that does not occur in solitude, clays sintered to colors that repeat across valleys in a harmony with no volcanic author, isotopes, again the honest ones would catch the coda, lead in cerussite that rose where ore never lay, mercury spikes that arrive without fire, calcium in corals swayed by nutrient roads that started in deserts rearranged by thoughtful hands, and these threads woven could make a fabric that feels like choice. Perhaps intention also erases itself, designs composted on purpose, metals unmade into salts, maps dissolved into rivers that carry only benefits forward, and the only proof left is an ease, fewer extremes recorded in caves and trees, deltas that choose width over spite, glaciers that retreat, and then hold a graceful line as if politely asked. We listen to the planet's larger memory for such eases, and accept that silence may be the truest testament, no monument, just the absence of harm written reliably over time, a legacy that reads as climate's untroubled sleep. And yet, if such civility can be left as a pattern rather than a statue, if memory can be taught to water and wind and wood, if the best techno-fossil might be a quieter earth, what then do we owe the archive now? What ratio to lean, what song to steady, what gentle alteration to make, and then release so that the next reader, far downstream, finds not our name, but our care. If the next reader far downstream should find not our name but our care, then we breathe more quietly and listen for the hush before a burst. The last wide inhale of the Proterozoic, the long patience that lines the doorway to sudden music. We are standing in the dim of almost where oxygen has learned steadiness, where bodies have practiced being with quilts and films and soft experiments, and the sea keeps its promise in layered calm while shorelines rehearse a tender geometry of steps. Maybe, maybe not, but ratios lean toward readiness. Carbon settling into a balance that hints at deeper burials to come, oxygen holding a ceiling that won't collapse at the first spark, sulfur narrowing its split, as redox lines retreat from places where new appetites will soon require room, and in these small adjustments we feel the metronome click a shade faster, as if time were finding its wrist. Subduction shapes the stage off to the side, arcs lifting, rifts opening, basins deepening like lungs, nutrients shuffled by mountain birth and mountain death, until currents can carry their letters to shelves in steady deliveries. And on those shelves sediments stack with the evenness of a book someone loves and reads at night. Entropy, faithful as ever, smooth stress into form and readies edges for easy motion, grains rounded enough to flow, shores braided enough to distribute, reefs revised into benches that will accept the weight of steps, and under this softness the archive grows more legible rather than less. Could it be that before every bloom there is a silence that teaches listening, microbial mats thick with experience passing their soft technologies to brighter shallows, stromatolite cities becoming schools of method rather than monuments of self, and the tools they lend are simple and exact. Stick, share, repeat, isotopes in quiet shales, keep the prelude without fanfare, nitrogen drifting heavier where recycling tightened just enough to train new food webs, oxygen in phosphates, whispering water's mild warmth at the toothless edge of a future full of teeth, strontium in carbonates nodding to rivers that learned at last how to arrive on time, atmosphere hums its stable chord, ozone a finer veil, greenhouse a careful quilt, clouds practicing restraint that still invites rain, and monsoons tap their measured code along margins where larvae will someday ride, where shells will grow band by steady band until light decides to speak louder. Maybe, maybe not, but even fossils of absence feel organized here, traceways that loop with purpose through matte-slicked flats, tidy burrows that break and resume as if patience had been taught in the dark, wrinkle marks aligned like notes shared between neighbors who are not yet a choir but could be by morning. We cradle a zircon that closed its doors to heat while these rehearsals went on above, uranium counting down with devotional calm, as if to assure the chapter a binding, and a tough, far away will later mark this moment with an ash, so fine it reads as a page number pressed into the book by a thoughtful thumb. Subduction, the librarian files the preface along margins of future mountains, tucks black shales into safe drawers, sends carbonates inland to become light-colored halls where rivers will one day echo, and we, much later, will read the rumor of a coming rush in the spar that cements them. Entropy keeps the lullaby in motion, gentle slumps that steepen and then stop, folds that cradle rather than crush, faults that slip on green soapstones with courtesy enough to spare the archives they pass, and the rocks, unalarmed, hold their breath without strain. Could it be that becoming requires a promise made before anyone arrives, an agreement between light and water to share, between river and basin to meet, between sky and leaf to trade devotion, and the Proterozoic fulfills its part with a patience that looks like grace. Isotopes in speleothems under young hills collect the humidity of a climate that does not punish curiosity, drip by measured drip, oxygen marking seasons that repeat without cruelty, carbon reflecting forests that murmur instead of shout, and the cave, unhurried, stores room for memory that hasn't happened yet. We run a hand across a bedding plane and feel the smoothness of soon, the way fine laminations suggest a canvas rather than a curtain, a stage that refuses to creak when the feet arrive, and in that smoothness an invitation: come, try, leave a line we can keep. Maybe, maybe not, but the sea already sketches the new grammar at the edge, small predators waking to gradients they can follow, eyes testing shadows for information, muscles learning to prefer a direction, and the mud obliges with clarity, preserving choices as gentle scratches no larger than a breath. Atmosphere waits without impatience, and currents hold their courses like lanterns set along a path no one has yet walked, and the planet as a whole feels like a held note, neither beginning nor ending, only ready. And yet, if readiness can be an archive, if patience can ripen into sudden complexity without breaking its calm, if silence itself can aim the next bright sentence, what door is already loosening its hinge just beyond the surf? What burst of forms will step forward all at once, and who among them will carry the old slow wisdom inside their new quick bodies so that the rush stays kind? What burst of forms will step forward all at once, and who among them will carry the old slow wisdom inside their new quick bodies so that the rush stays kind? We lean into the Cambrian hush before, a shoreline holding its breath as if listening for its own name, and then the water writes in plural, segmented strides pressed into silt, eyes catching the gradient between shadow and meal, fins learning to become arguments for direction, not because destiny shouted, but because the stage was ready, and the actors remembered the rehearsals glowing in mats and reefs. Maybe, maybe not, but the archive brightens all at once, trilobites multiplying like patient arithmetic, turned into song, small shells testing calcium like a borrowed certainty, burrows deepening until lamination gives way to tapestry, and the sea begins to keep a diary thick enough for fingers to follow. Isotopes keep time beneath the applause, carbon swaying light where blooms pull hard and bury their second thoughts, oxygen in phosphates, telling the temperature at which a tooth decided to be hard, sulfur narrowing where oxygen dared stay in deeper rooms, and these ratios, steady and unromantic, become the scaffolding for astonishment. Subduction stands off stage as usual, cues delivered in the language of relief and uplift. New shelves where currents sought nutrients into reliable aisles, volcanic ash, falling like page markers between pulses, basins deepened like lungs longed for by swimmers who have not yet learned the word for breath, and mountains far inland teach rivers an exuberant script that ends in delta crescents wide enough to teach patience to the sea. Entropy cooperates, rounding edges just enough to make speed economical, smoothing dunes so that trilobites can run like thoughts across a page, letting reefs collapse into rubble that seedlings of coral will mend, and even decay enters with generosity, returning chance to circulation so that novelty can afford another try. Could it be that memory wears bodies now, sponges refining their architectures until flow itself becomes an organ, echinoderms discovering five-fold symmetry, as if star and seabed shared a private language, chordate threads strengthening along a promise that one day a spine will remember an ocean even while standing in air, and each innovation feels less like conquest than confession. We were always practicing. Fossils catch the breath lines between motions, trails that hesitate then surge, coprolites like proof of simple economies, balancing, molting suits stacked like quiet stairways of becoming, and the mud, newly fluent, edits nothing but tantrums, keeping the rest with a calm accuracy that feels like love. Atmosphere holds steady above, greenhouse warm enough to prevent a mean night, oxygen loyal without extravagance, ozone a careful gauze that softens noon, and clouds walk the tropics with polite regularity, their shadows turning the sea into a slow metronome that gills can memorize. Maybe, maybe not, but eyes multiply, and the world increases in information, predators writing interruptions like commas that teach rhythm, prey composing detours that become style, filter feeders converting currents into paragraphs of food, and suddenly the ocean is literature where once it was arithmetic, and the reader is anyone with a pulse. Isotopes in tiny shells become calendars, increments so narrow they carry the weather of a week, strontium whispering which river brought which mountain's patience to the shelf, uranium in carbonates, nodding to the slow lifting and lowering of seas that choreograph migrations like quiet announcements. Subduction gathers the pages between acts without rushing, tucking surprise under certainty, letting gneiss and schist someday bear the imprint of a bright few million years as faint as perfume, and a zircon cooled in an ash at the margin will secure the chapter's date with a clarity no wave can blur. Entropy closes each day with a lull, stormbeds sorted from coarse to sigh, turbidites grading their nerves into calm fecal snow, sifting down to the deep where anoxic rooms keep what they can with dignity, and overnight the sea resets the desk without hiding the drafts. Perhaps the kindest truth is that the burst is only the visible part of a longer kindness, cycles tuned just enough, feedbacks aligned without drama, losses absorbed by breadth, and the Cambrian feels less like a revolution than an agreement kept at last. We hold a small trilobite, and feel its facets like a handful of mornings, see in its enrolled posture a memory of fear that did not harden into cruelty, and we think of how eyes made mercy possible by allowing distance to become choice. And yet if sudden variety can arrive without breaking the old slow music, If new bodies can carry ancient patience into sharper motion, if stone can keep the rush as clearly as the calm, what other chapters wait beyond this bright awakening? The long rehearsals of forests on land, the quiet invention of roots, the first breath taken where air is thin and memory must learn to stand.